It's a feat of staggering genius on part of the medieval grammarians that they were able to take the entire Arabic language, all of it, and make it revolve around one central topic, and that is the topic of grammatical inflection, what we call al-i'rab. Everything, absolutely everything that's discussed within the science of Nahu is discussed only because it either directly relates to this mechanism or it indirectly relates to this mechanism. This is what the entire manuals are written for, in order to explain to the student what is i'rab and what are the things that relate to i'rab. So there might be about 20 or 30 isolated topics that need to be understood, but they're not all created equal, because recall that I said either directly or indirectly. So the things that relate directly to the mechanism are obviously more important. In other words, the total possible ways an ism could be used in the language is 20,000 times more important than understanding the numerous indicators, including the obscure ones that hardly ever get used. Okay, so what happens in these manuals, like the Muqaddimatul al-ajrumiyyah, is they spend an inordinate amount of time speaking about the various indicators of i'rab, alamatul i'rab. These things are important, but more important than all of this is knowing what rafa means. What does rafa mean? What does Naṣb mean? So I have an earlier presentation that's a prerequisite, and everybody watching this should at least look in the description. So this series of videos is meant for students that have been studying Arabic grammar for a solid 6 months, using a proper approach. So if that's you, then feel free to keep watching. And if that's not you, then look in the description. Please look in the description and go watch the 3-hour workshop. Because I've been teaching Arabic for well over 20 years to over 7,000 students. And what I've noticed is that the biggest cause of confusion amongst struggling Arabic students is they don't understand relative importance. Like, all the topics are given to them and they're taught in a disconnected way. So what these books do, these grammar manuals like this legendary Muqaddimatul al-ajrumiyyah, is it's not disconnected. There's a rhythm, there's a structure to the book, but then it's a reverse structure. In other words, the things that are least important for people that are unfamiliar with the language. Because you got to understand, the book was written 700 years ago for primarily an Arab audience, like teenagers or young students that Arabic was their mother tongue, and they had already understood intuitively how the language works. So they're being given these details so they don't make a mistake. So these things, they're important, but you need to know how the language works first, and you need to know the total possible ways the ism could be used. So throughout this series of ajrumiya presentations that I've started creating, and we're at about hour 9. Okay, so we had the presentation, which was 1 hour, and then there was a 7-hour deep dive, and then now we're moving on with our next leg of the book, and inshallah after this there will be one more, and that will conclude the entire book. Originally I thought it would take about 30 hours, but turns out that inshallah we'll be able to do it in half that time. Okay, so I'm enjoying making these videos. So my only ask is that you post in the comments below and let us know how it's going. And if you're watching them, then at least tell us where you are and how it's going. If you have any questions whatsoever about the content, about the material, about the translations I give you when I'm translating the text, then please ask below and I will respond personally. So without any further ado, now let's move it to the computer and let's continue with the mu'rabat, the chapter on the mu'rabat. Let's begin. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala ma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so we're now continuing with the al-ajrumiya matan. Okay, so we'll read a couple of pages from the matan, and then we'll spend the next hour or 2 hours redoing that from the at-tuhfatu saniyah, the commentary on the muqaddimatul al-ajrumiyyah. So this session, it redoes what the author gave to you in the earlier segment. Basically, the focus was the indicators of i'rab in the earlier section, and now he speaks about the particular words that experience i'rab, the mu'rabat. So there's two things in the language that are mu'rab. First of all, most isms, and number 2, the mudari verb that is empty of the 2 noons, the noon of emphasis and the noon of feminine plurality. When a mudari verb is empty of these 2 noons, then it does receive changes, and depending on whether it's on its own or whether it has a particular Naṣb giving agents or Jazm giving agents before it. Okay, so he says here that combining all of the mu'rabat together, regardless of those that are isms or whether it's a verb, he says that there are two types. Mu'rabat could be categorized into 2 types. And this is something that you could have already understood earlier. Okay, because he detailed these things, and now what he's doing is he's restating it again, but instead of focusing on the indicators of i'rab, he's now focusing on the particular words that experience these i'rabs. So now he's more in line with the methodology as opposed to the indicators isolated, talk about the dhamma, and here are the places where dhamma is used, here are the places where fatha is used. Instead of that, he speaks about the categories of ism. Okay, and if you remember in the very first video, that's what we led with. And we explained this entire section based on the categories of isms and the methods of reflection. And we said there's 9 methods of reflection when you take into account the fact that i'rab could be reflected through vowels, and it could also be reflected through letters, and that there could be a full and unique vowel for every state. So 3 states, 3 vowels, or you could have an element of sharing and a bit of recycling, a little like I gave her her book in English, because the word her was used twice. One of them is in Naṣb, I gave her, and then when I said her book, then that's a possessive example, I gave her her book. So in the masculine, they would be distinct, but in the feminine, it's the same word reused and recycled. So some recycling happens in these Arabic words as well, that instead of 3 vowels, 3 unique vowels, or 3 unique case endings, in order to indicate the 3 states, we only have 2. Rafa has its unique case ending, and Naṣb and Jar both share a common ending. Okay, so it could be with vowels, it could be with letters. Both the vowels one, the vowel reflection could be with a unique vowel for every state, or the vowel one could be with an element of recycling. Same is true for the letters, that you have particular isms in the language that are reflected through letters, and there's a different letter to show every one of the 3 states. So Rafa has its own unique letter, Naṣb has its own, and Jar has its own, like Abuka, Abaka, and Abika, like the 5 isms. They're reflected with letters. And then letters could also be with some recycling, and that happens in the dual, that happens in the sound masculine plural. And then there's assumption-based reflection. So this author, he completely ignores categorizing based on whether the i'rab is lafdhan or taqdeeran. He alludes to it and he hints to it, but he doesn't spell it out. So he say that al-qadi is reflected with dhamma, zaydun is reflected with dhamma, Musa is reflected with dhamma, al-asa, ghulami, they're all reflected with dhamma. The difference is in zayd, the dhamma is visible, zaydun, zaydan, zaydin, and in al-asa or ghulami, it's not visible. So ghulami, 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 it would stay the same. The reason is because there's a pronunciation issue, there's a ta'adhur, there's a thiqal, there's a heaviness, there's an awkwardness, or the last letter of the noun is preoccupied with the harakatul munasaba. The ya necessitates kasra, ghulami, ghulami, ghulami. So these things, the author, he expects you to figure it out. He expects you to figure out which of them is lafdhan, which of them are lafdhan, and which of them are taqdeeran, and so he categorizes. Okay, so that's what he's doing. So everything that could have been understood in the earlier section, he restates it again from the different perspectives. So instead of focusing on the indicators, he now speaks about the mu'rabat themselves, the particular words that receive those indicators that were detailed in the previous several sessions. He says, Faslun al-mu'rabat. So this is the author, the Ibn Ajurum, the matan. He says, chapter regarding those words that experience i'rab. He says, al-mu'rabatu qismani, the words that experience grammatical positioning are of 2 types. Notice the way I'm translating it. The words that experience grammatical positioning are of 2 types. So this includes most isms, pronouns excluded, and demonstrative pronouns excluded, and certain 2-letter isms that are used for asking questions like man and ma. Those are excluded. Asma al-istifham, various kinds of pronouns basically, they're all excluded. Hada, hadihi, and so these things, they're not being talked about here. So it's most isms. So when he says al-mu'rabat, he means most isms, and he means the mudari verb, particularly the mudari verb that does not have the noon of feminine plurality attached to it, yaf'alna, taf'alna, because that one's mabni, and also the mudari verb that is free of the noon of emphasis, the heavy version or the light version. La yusjananna wa la yakuna min as-saghirin. La yusjananna, he will definitely be imprisoned, and he will absolutely be of those that are disgraced. La yusjananna wa la yakuna min as-saghirin. Yakunu became wa la yakunam. So if the noon of emphasis attaches to the end of the mudari, then it becomes mabni, and the last letter of the verb becomes fixed on fatha, and I'll explain more about that shortly, as it comes in the matan or in the sharah. He says, قِسْمٌ يُعْرَبُ بِالْحَرَكَاتِ. There's a category of words that are grammatically reflected through vowels. وَقِسْمٌ يُعْرَبُ بِالْحُرُوفِ. And there's another category of words. Okay, now I'm saying words, not isms, because the mudari verb is included as well. Grammatically reflected through letters. فَالَّذِي يُعْرَبُ بِالْحَرَكَاتِ أَرْبَعَةُ أَنْوَاعٍ. And in the other editions of the book it says أَرْبَعَةُ أَشْيَاء. So those words which are grammatically reflected through vowels are of four categories. Or you could say are four things. There's four things in the language that are grammatically reflected through vowels. Parentheses, either explicit or assumed. Okay, so lafdhan or taqdeeran, you got to keep that in mind. And the taqdeeran can only occur in three ways. Taqdeeran occurs either if there's an alif, the word you're dealing with is ending in an alif, or it's ending in a ya preceded by a kasra, or it's ending, or it's mudaf to the ya pronoun. Okay, so if it's ending in an alif, then the taqdeer is full. You know, like all i'rab is muqaddar. So dhamma is assumed, fatha is assumed, and jar, all three of them are assumed. If it's with a ya preceded by a kasra, then that's al-qadi, it's called al-manqus, and the rafa and jar are assumed. Okay, but it's dhamma that's assumed, and that's the point here. It's not a letter that's assumed, it's a vowel that's assumed. Okay, so the four things in the language that are grammatically reflected through vowels are the mufrad ism. The mufrad ism, and okay, so mufrad ism regardless of whether it's fully declinable or change restricted. Now there's a distinction. The change restricted one is partially reflected, like jar is reflected with fatha, but at any rate, whatever reflection it is, it's through vowels, which is the point right now. وَجَمْعُ التَّكْسِيرِ and broken plurals. And again, broken plurals could be further divided into those broken plurals which are munsarif versus those broken plurals which are change restricted. The munsarif ones reflect fully, and the change restricted ones reflect partially. وَجَمْعُ الْمُؤَنَّثِ السَّالِمِ and the sound feminine plural is also reflected through vowels. There's a partial reflection, and both Naṣb and jar share a common reflection, but that's besides the point right now. The point right now is vowels versus letters. وَالْفِعْلُ الْمُضَارِعُ الَّذِي لَمْ يَتَّصِلْ بِآخِرِهِ شَيْءٍ. And the mudari verb to the end of which nothing at all is attached. So there's no noon of feminine plurality. There's also no noon of emphasis, and there's also none of those pronouns. The ضمير التثنية وضمير الجماعة, the dual pronoun, two, regardless of whether it's two men or two women, and the masculine plural pronoun يفعلون واو, that can't be attached either, and the ya pronoun, which is for the addressed female, that's also not there. So when none of these things are attached, then the mudari verb will be grammatically reflected through vowels. Now there's further details. So the author here is summarizing it. Okay, continuing forward. وَكُلُّهَا. Okay, so he's saying all of them should be. Says turfa'u. All of them, their rafa is reflected with dhamma, their nasab is reflected with fatha, their jar is reflected with kasra, and their jazm is reflected with sukun. Okay, so when he says are, he means should. This is the asl. This is how it should be. وَكُلُّهَا تُرْفَعُ بِالضَّمَّةِ. And all of them should be reflected with dhamma. This is true for the ism and the mudari. وَتُنْصَبُ بِالْفَتْحَةِ. And their nasab should be reflected with fatha. Again, true for the ism as well as for the mudari. وَتُخْفَضُ بِالْكَسْرَةِ. This only applies to the ism because the verb doesn't have jar. And their jar is reflected with kasra. In other words, it should. So in the case of the sound feminine plural, you will have a fatha substituting for a kasra. So you're going to get into the whole substitution business. So we have a should and we have what actually is. And then he talks about that in the next paragraph. وَتُجْزَمُ بِالسُّكُونِ. And their jazm should be reflected with sukun, and that really only applies to the mudari verb because the ism doesn't experience jazm. وَخَرَجَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْيَاء. So earlier he mentioned four things. He mentioned the ism mufrad, he mentioned the jama mukassar, jama taksir, he mentioned جمع المؤنث السالم, and he mentioned the mudari verb, empty of both noons and also no pronouns attached to it, like the alif of duality, the waw of plurality, and the ya of the addressed female. So in other words, singular conjugations of the mudari. He mentioned 4 things. And he says all of them should be like that, and then 3 things are excluded. وَخَرَجَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْيَاء. So when you're reading this, you say, are these exceptions? What's the deal? Like, I mean, وَخَرَجَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ, you mentioned 4 and you're excluding 3, so why not just talk about that one? And why start with 4 only to remove 3? But you gotta understand what he's doing here. Like, within those 4, there's actually more, because the first one subdivides. The ism mufrad subdivides into munsarif version and the ghair munsarif version. Al-ism al-mufrad, there's 2 versions of it. There's the fully declinable one, and there's the... So he's saying that from the A, B, C, D, half of A is excluded, not the whole A. Half of A is excluded. The ghair munsarif subset of ism mufrad is excluded because its kasra, its jar is not reflected with kasra. He's going to say that, the commentator. He's going to say that. Okay, so, and the sound feminine plural, the entire category is excluded in the sense that its Naṣb is not reflected with fatha. There's another vowel that substitutes for fatha. And in the Jam'u Taksir also, we have the ghair munsarif thing there going on. And other than that, what else is excluded? So he said 3 things are excluded. So I guess the mudari verb that ends in a weak letter would be excluded. Like yad'u, yarda, yad'u, and yarmi. These 3, their jazm is not reflected with sukun. It's true that their rafa is reflected with dhamma, their nasab is reflected with fatha, but their jazm is not reflected with sukun. In yad'u, yarmi, and yarda, their jazm is reflected with the drop of the lam kalima, the hazf of the last letter. So yad'u becomes lam yad'u, yarmi becomes lam yarmi, and yarda becomes lam yarda. So you see, so in the first paragraph, he talked about the 4 kinds of words in the language that are grammatically reflected with vowels, and then that would mean numerous states, and every state having a vowel. And then the vowel would normally be, and then he listed it, and then he says, from what I just told you, which is not just 4 things, it was like maybe 12 things, because if there's 4 categories of words, and each one has 3 states, and so the exception is like, it's not the entire thing that's the exclusion. It's maybe 30% of it. Okay, so it becomes like, so this, now it makes a little more sense what he's talking about. وَخَرَجَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْيَاء, and there's 3 things that are excluded from the default that I just established in the previous paragraph. What are they? جَمْعُ الْمُؤَنَّثِ السَّالِمِ يُنْصَبُ بِالْكَسْرَةِ. The جَمْعُ الْمُؤَنَّثِ السَّالِمِ, 66% of its reflection is as was discussed above. 66%. 33% differs, and let me tell you what that is. يُنْصَبُ بِالْكَسْرَةِ, its Naṣb is reflected with the kasra. وَالْإِسْمُ الَّذِي لَا يَنْصَرِفْ, and the change restricted ism, parentheses, regardless of whether it's a singular one or a broken plural one, يُخْفَةُ بِالْفَتْحَةِ, its jar is reflected with the fatha. So in other words, its rafa is reflected with dhamma according to the default. Its nasab is reflecting with fatha according to the default. The only part within the change restricted word that defies the default is the jar. وَالْفِعْلُ الْمُضَارِعُ الْمُعْتَلُّ الْآخِرِ, and the mudari verb which ends in a weak last letter, either an alif, a waw, or a ya, يُجْزَمُ بِحَذْفِ آخِرِهِ, its jazm is reflected through the omission of its last letter. So that's everything you need to know about the words in the language whose grammatical reflection is through vowels. Okay, now he speaks about those that are reflected through letters. وَالَّذِي يُعْرَبُ بِالْحُرُوفِ أَرْبَعَةُ أَنْوَاعٍ, and those words in the language that are grammatically reflected through vowels are 4 categories. التثنية, the dual. وَجَمْعُ الْمُذَكَّرِ السَّالِمُ, and the sound masculine plural. وَالْأَسْمَاءُ الْخَمْسَةُ, and the 5 isms, provided that all of the conditions are met, that they're singular and they're non-diminutive and they're mudaf to other than the ya first person, abuka, abuka, akhuka, etc. So those words, their reflection is through letters. وَالْأَفْعَالُ الْخَمْسَةُ, and the 5 verbs other than the verbs that were talked about in the earlier category, and those would be the duals and the plurals, and conjugation number 10 when you're speaking to a female. وَهِيَ يَفْعَلَانِ وَتَفْعَلَانِ وَيَفْعَلُونَ وَتَفْعَلُونَ وَتَفْعَلِينَ. Okay, now he details them separately, so he doesn't do the whole default thing that he did above. Like he established the dhamma, fatha, kasra, sukun, and then spoke about anything that goes against that, because entire categories don't defy it totally. They only defy it partially. So they're violating the default, but only partially. So it makes sense to establish the default and then create an exclusion. So over here, there's no commonality. They're so radically different that there's no commonality. So he just as for, he just all four of them separately. فَأَمَّا التَّثْنِيَةُ, as for the dual, فَتُرْفَعُ بِالْأَلِفِ, is rafa is reflected with an alif, رَجُلَانِ, وَتُنْصَبُ وَتُخْفَضُ بِالْيَاءِ, and both its nasab as well as its jar is reflected with a ya, parentheses, the ya is preceded by a fatha, and the noon has a kasra, رَجُلَيْنِ, رَأَيْتُ رَجُلَيْنِ. وَأَمَّا جَمْعُ الْمُذَكَّرِ السَّالِمُ, and as for the sound masculine plural, فَيُرْفَعُ بِالْوَاوِ, its rafa is reflected with waw, وَيُنْصَبُ وَيُخْفَضُ بِالْيَاءِ, and both its nasab as well as its jar is reflected with a ya. And this time the ya has a kasra, the ya is preceded by a kasra, and the noon has a fatha, muslimuna versus muslimina. Okay, we're going to redo all of this in the commentary, inshallah, so you're going to get a ton of examples right there, inshallah. وَأَمَّا الْأَسْمَاءُ الْخَمْسَةُ, and as for the 5 isms, فَتُرْفَعُ بِالْوَاوِ وَتُنْصَبُ بِالْأَلِفِ وَتُخْفَضُ بِالْيَاءِ, their rafa is reflected with waw, their nasab is reflected with alif, and their jar is reflected with ya. وَأَمَّا الْأَفْعَالُ الْخَمْسَةُ, and as for the 5 verbs, فَتُرْفَعُ بِالنُّونِ, their rafa is reflected with the presence of the noon, وَتُنْصَبُ وَتُجْزَمُ بِحَذْفِهَا, and both their nasab as well as their jazm is reflected with the omission of the noon. Okay, and that concludes this section on the al-mu'rabat. So he created 8 categories, 4 of them reflected with vowels, and 4 of them reflected with letters. So the ones that are reflected with vowels, he made no distinction between whether the vowel is lafdhan, spoken, visible, or whether the vowel is understood. So if you were to make that distinction, it would create al-maqsoor, and it will create al-qadi, and it will create any ism that's mudaf to the first person, so your number would increase. So instead of 4, you'd have 7, based on that factor alone. And then the munsarif, ghair munsarif thing, he never made that distinction. And if you were to isolate the munsarif and list that separately, then you wouldn't have 4, you would have 8 within the al-mu'rab bil-harakat. You'd have 8 categories of ism. Now over here within the words, okay, and also the mudari verb, I never even took into account the mudari verb, that would create an even larger number. Okay, because the mudari verb could have it could be like sahih, it could be mu'tal wawi wa ya'i, and it could be mu'tal alifi, because the alifi one is assumed both in rafa and nasab. Yarda wa lan yarda. The wawi ya'i one, its rafa is assumed, the dhamma is not pronounced, but the nasab is pronounced. So yad'u wa yarmi, lan yad'u wa lan yarmiya. You actually say it, lan yad'u wa lan yarmiya, and then the jazm is with the drop of the last letter in all of them. So it would create further categories. So over here, the ones that are reflected with letters, he says dual, sound masculine plural. Now the dual, there's a technical dual, and then there's words that look like dual, but technically they're not dual. So al-mulhaq bil-muthanna. So you have the muthanna and you have the al-mulhaq bil-muthanna, and you have words that aren't even dual anyways. They just, like the number 2. Isnani wa ithnatani, they're not dual, because you're not saying 2 twos. You're just saying 2 as in the concept of 2, which is a singular notion. And similarly, the numbers from 20 until 90, the multiples of 10, 20, 30, 40, those ones, they're not plural, because you're not talking about the 1980s. I grew up in the 1980s. I grew up in the 1970s or the 1990s. You're saying 90. So 90. So if you wanted to say 90s, as in the 1990s, then tis'una would become tis'iniyat, and you'd have either add an alif and a ta, and it become like 90s, right? Okay, so those things are not plural, but they're reflected like the sound masculine plural, so they're mulhaq bi jam' al-mudhakkar salim, so it will create a larger number. So in the Hidayat al-Nahw book, the numerous categories of ism are 16, and the methods of reflection are 9. So over here, we're getting a lot closer now. When you add in those distinctions, then it becomes like very similar. Okay, so I think we're done with this, and now we can move on to the commentary, and then see what Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid has for us. Okay. So he says here, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, al-mu'rabatu, the words that experience i'rab. Qala, the author, he says, the muallif, he says, faslun al-mu'rabatu qismani. The words in the language that experience i'rab are of two types. قسم يعرب بالحركات, there's a category that's grammatically reflected through vowels, وقسم يعرب بالحروف, and there's another category that's grammatically reflected through letters. In other words, they experience the grammar, and also the grammar shows. And the showing is through either vowels, or the indicator is either a vowel or the indicator is a letter. وأقول أراد المؤلف رحمه الله تعالى. Okay, this is important. He says that the author, what's his purpose here? In this entire subsection, what is he trying to tell us? His goal, the author's goal, Allah have mercy upon him, through this chapter, is to explain briefly the ruling of all of the things that were previously mentioned in detail regarding the indicators of i'rab. So he says fi mawadi' al-i'rab. I think this should be fi alamat al-i'rab. Okay, because mawadi' doesn't really make sense. Look what he's saying. أراد المؤلف رحمه الله تعالى بهذا الفصل أن يبين على وجه الإجمال حكم ما سبق تفصيله في علامات الإعراب. Because there's the alamat of i'rab, there's the mawadi' of i'rab, and then there's the roles, the total possible ways in which the ism or the mudari verb could be used. There's three things, and this is the distinction that most people never get, right? So the earlier section of the book was about the indicators of i'rab. It wasn't about the places where these indicators are used. In other words, the words themselves. So the words themselves would be the mawadi' al-i'rab, the places where the i'rab occurs, the nouns that experience the i'rabs, or the mudari verb. And then they're categorized based on whether it's a letter doing it or whether it's a vowel doing it. So everything that was understood in detail earlier, when speaking about the indicators of i'rab, the author now wants to restate that in a summarized way. Restate all of that briefly. In other words, state it in a different way. Okay, so instead of focusing on the indicators and going indicator by indicator or alama by alama, like the states, and then within each state you have numerous indicators, and then you speak about the dhamma is used, the dhamma serves as a reflection for rafa here, here, and here, and then the waw is used here, the alif is used here. Instead of doing it that way, we take it from the other angle, and we talk about the particular isms, and then we make distinctions that are implied and understood earlier. They're being restated here explicitly. So the things that were understood implicitly earlier are being restated here with focus explicitly. Okay, so that's what he means. So if you want the full instruction load, you go and read the previous pages. But if you want something that you can easily memorize, here it is now. So this is what you can easily memorize, and then you can work it out yourself. So that's what he's saying here. And I think the editor here he says, فَصَّلَهَا فِي مَا سَبَقَ لِتُفْهَمْ. So he detailed all of this in the earlier sections of the book, لِتُفْهَمْ, in order that it could be grasped and understood. وَأَجْمَلَهَا هُنَا, and he's summarizing here. أجمل means to summarize. فَصَّلَ means to detail. Okay, لِتُحْفَظ, in order that it could be memorized. Okay, so that's what he's doing. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so I would change this word here. Okay, post in the comments below if you agree with me, or does he mean something else? Is there justification for the way he's saying it? So the ruling of whatever was explained in detail earlier. So sabaqa means to proceed. The details of which preceded earlier in the section of the alamatul i'rab, the author now wants to explain it in a summarized fashion. Ala wajhi al-ijmal, he wants to now restate that again briefly. Okay, so the purpose of the detail was so that people can grasp it, and the purpose of the summary is so that people can memorize it. والمواضع التي سبق ذكر أحكامها في الإعراب تفصيلا ثمانية. And the occasions, the rule, والمواضع التي سبق ذكر أحكامها في الإعراب تفصيلا ثمانية. في الإعراب تفصيلا ثمانية. So this word تفصيلا is actually clarifying ذكر. Okay, because you can mention something إجمالا and you can mention something تفصيلا. And those particular words, or those occasions here means words, and those particular words, the detailed rulings of which were mentioned in the section of I'rab are 8. Okay, so I sort of, that was a translation that isn't word for word, but that's really what he's trying to say. I think that's fine. وَهِيَ الْإِسْمُ الْمُفْرَدُ, and they are, number one, the singular ism. وَجَمْعُ التَّكْسِيرِ, and the broken plural. وَجَمْعُ الْمُؤَنَّثِ سَالِمُ, and the sound feminine plural. وَالْفِعْلُ الْمُضَارِعُ الَّذِي لَمْ يَتَّصِلْ بِآخِرِهِ شَيْءٍ, and the mudari verb to the end of which nothing at all is attached. والمثنى, the dual. وجمع المذكر السالم, the sound masculine plural. والأسماء الخمسة, the 5 isms. والأفعال الخمسة, the 5 verbs. وهذه الأنواع التي هي مواضع الإعراب, and these categories which are the places of إعراب. In other words, the particular words in the language that experience إعراب. تنقسم إلى قسمين, they divide into 2 categories. You have 4 and 4. القسم الأول يعرب بالحركات, the first category is grammatically reflected through vowels. والقسم الثاني, and the second category, is grammatically reflected through letters. وسيأتي بيان كل نوع منهما تفصيلا, and the detailed explanation of each one of these 2 categories will come shortly. سيأتي. المعرب بالحركات, those that are grammatically reflected through vowels. قال فالذي يعرب بالحركات أربعة أشياء. So the muallif, the author, he says those that are grammatically reflected through vowels are 4 things in the language. الاسم المفرد, the singular ism. وجمع التكسير, the broken plural. Regardless of fully declinable, change restricted, doesn't matter. The reflection is through vowels. وجمع المؤنث السالم, the sound feminine plural. والفعل المضارع الذي لم يتصل بآخره شيء, and the mudari verb to the end of which nothing at all is attached. Okay, the commentator. وأقول الحركات ثلاثة. I would begin like this. I would say that the vowels are 3. وهي الضمة والفتحة والكسرة, and they are ضمة فتحة كسرة. ويلحق بها السكون, and to these 3 you can add on sukun. It's not a vowel, it's an absence of vowel, but it's used as an indicator. So the indicators of I'rab, we have the ضمة, the فتحة, the كسرة, and we have sukun. وقد علمت أن المعربات على قسمين, and you already know that the words in the language that experience I'rab are of 2 types. قسم يعرب بالحركات, a type which is grammatically reflected through vowels. وقسم يعرب بالحروف, and a type which is grammatically reflected through letters. وهذا شروع في بيان القسم الأول, and in this paragraph the author is now beginning in explaining and detailing the first category, which is grammatically reflected through vowels. وهو أربعة أشياء, and it consists of 4 things. There's 4 things in this first category, and they are, number 1, الاسم المفرد. ومثاله محمد والدرس. Okay, now several examples to highlight everything. ومثاله محمد والدرس من قولك, and the example of the ism mufrad are the 2 words Muhammad and ad-dars occurring in your statement ذاكر محمد الدرس, that Muhammad studied the lesson. ذاكر محمد الدرس. So Muhammadun is an example of an ism which is in Rafa, reflected through Dhamma, in Dhamma is a vowel, and ad-darsa, over here we have the ism in Naṣb, reflected with the Fatha, and the Fatha is a vowel, and both the Dhamma and the Fatha are spoken. This Dhammatul Lafdiyya and the Fatha as well is spoken. He says فذاكر. So the word ذاكر is a verb. In other words, it's not the point of the example. The point of the example is not ذاكر. But he talks about it. He says فذاكر فعل ماض مبني على الفتح. The verb ذاكر is a madi verb, and it's not experiencing any grammar at all, and it's fixed on a fatha. So ذَكَرَ, the ra has a fatha. So if they ask you what's the significance of the ra having a fatha, you say there's no significance, because that's just the way it's built. It's a mabni vowel, and it's not suggesting any grammatical positioning. In fact, there is no grammatical positioning. He says لا محل له من الإعراب, and the word doesn't have any grammatical positioning whatsoever. Okay, so this way he expressed ذَكَرَ, it is beyond scope. Like, I mean, he could have focused on Muhammad and ad-dars and not talked about ذَكَرَ at all, and we would have been perfectly okay with that. Because in order to properly understand what he's saying here, there's a discussion that hasn't yet been given. Okay, like I think I sort of gave it to you in the first video when I explained the definition of grammar, and I said grammar has two parts. There's understanding the circumstances of the last letters of the three parts of speech from the perspective of whether they experience grammatical positioning or don't, whether they experience grammatical states or they don't. So if they don't at all, then that's called true mabni. And a madi is an example of a word that doesn't experience any grammatical positioning at all. What does that mean? That means that any harf that can come before a madi verb, like qad can come before a madi verb, ma can come before a madi verb, what it does is it changes the meaning of the verb and makes it negative. Ma makes it negative, qad makes it near, past, or whatever else can come, like in can come at the beginning of a madi verb as well. Okay, so whatever harf can come at the beginning of a madi verb, it won't change the way the verb looks. Okay, so the verb would be mabni. Okay, because it doesn't need any change in order to differentiate between any roles. Okay, so that's what it means. لا محل له من الإعراب. Now, in the case of a pronoun, which is not a verb, a pronoun is an ism. Pronouns are also mabni, but when describing a pronoun occurring within the sentence, we will say that this na is mabni ala sukun, because alif has a sukun, and it's in the place of rafa because it's representing the fa'il. It's so if it was a normal word, the normal word would have dhammas, but the na here is mabni. Now, okay, so that's that's an example of a mabni that is experiencing a grammatical positioning and has a place in i'rab. Madi verbs don't have any place in i'rab. Okay? Now getting to the point of the example, he says, well, Muhammadun fa'ilun, and Muhammad is a fa'il, and it is marfu, and then he explains why it's marfu. Well, actually he doesn't. He does. He says fa'ilun marfu means it's marfu, it's a fa'il and it's in rafa. Or you could just say it's in rafa because it's fa'il. Same thing. وَعَلَامَةُ رَفْعِهِ الضَّمَّةُ ظَاهِرَةُ, and the sign of it being in rafa is the explicit visible dhamma. وَالدَّرْسَ مَفْعُولٌ بِهِ مَنْصُوبٌ, and the word ad-darsa is the object of the verb and it's in the state of naṣb. وَعَلَامَةُ نَصْبِهِ الْفَتْحَةُ ظَاهِرَةُ, and the sign of its naṣb is the explicit visible fatha. وَكُلٌّ مِّن مُحَمَّدْ وَالدَّرْسِ اسْمٌ مُفْرَدٌ, and each one of the two words, Muhammad and Dars, is a singular ism. Okay? Jam'u taksir. The other thing in the language that is grammatically reflected with vowels is the Jam'u taksir. وَمِثَالُهُ التَّلَامِيذُ وَالدُّرُوسِ, and the example would be the word students and the word lessons. And the statement حَفِظَ التَّلَامِيذُ الدُّرُوسَ, that the students memorized the lessons. So التَّلَامِيذُ الدُّرُوسَ, and then he unpacks it the way he did the earlier one. فَحَفِظَ, so the verb حَفِظَ is a فِعْلٌ مَاضٍ مَبْنِيٌّ عَلَى الْفَتْحِ, is a madi verb that's fixed on fatha, لَا مَحَلَّ لَهُ مِنَ الْإِعْرَابِ, and it itself is not being induced by any governing agent. So there's nothing before it causing anything to it. So it doesn't have i'rab. So neither is it accurate to call it, say it's in rafa or in naṣb or just, it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to the madi verb. Now if it was a mudari and there was nothing before it, we would say the mudari is in rafa because of absence of naṣb giver and jazm giver, but this is a madi. وَالتَّلَامِيذُ فَاعِلٌ مَرْفُوعٌ, and the word talamid is a fa'il and it's in the state of rafa. وَعَلَامَةُ رَفْعِهَا الضَّمَّةُ ظَاهِرَةُ, and the sign of its being in rafa is the visible dhamma. وَالدُّرُوسَ مَفْعُولٌ بِهِ مَنْصُوبٌ, and the word durus in the example حَفِظَ التَّلَامِيذُ الدُّرُوسَ is a maf'ul bihi that's in naṣb. وَعَلَامَةُ نَصْبِهِ الْفَتْحَةُ الظَّاهِرَةُ, and the sign and the indicator of its naṣb is the visible explicit fatha. وَكُلٌّ مِّن التَّلَامِيذِ وَالدُّرُوسِ جَمْعُ تَكْسِيرٍ, and each one of these two words, at-talamid and durus, is a broken plural. So the second thing in the language that is grammatically reflected with vowels is the broken plural. And then he moves on to the sound feminine plural. وَمِثَالُهُ الْمُؤْمِنَاتُ وَالصَّلَوَاتُ. And he gives two examples. Now, he'll carefully give you an example of rafa and jar, but he'll avoid giving an example of Naṣb. Okay, because Naṣb, remember, Naṣb in the sound feminine plural, Naṣb is not reflected with fatha. So he's going to use a sentence where the word mu'minat and the word salawat are occurring in rafa and in jar. Okay, look what he does. من قولك, in your statement, خشع المؤمنات في الصلوات, that the Muslim women were humble and were praying with concentration and devotion, had concentration and devotion within their prayers. So the Muslim women had concentration and devotion within the prayers. So over here, فخشع فعل ماض مبني على الفتح لا محل له من الإعراب. Okay, we already explained what that means. والمؤمنات فاعل مرفوع وعلامة رفعه هي الضمة ظاهرة. So it's in rafa, and the sign of its rafa is the visible dhamma. وفي حرف جر, and the preposition في, it's a حرف جر. والصلوات مجرور بفي, and the word salawat is majrur because of the fi. وعلامة جره هي الكسرة ظاهرة, and the indicator of his jar is the visible kasra. وكل من المؤمنات والصلوات, and each of the two words, the word mu'minat and the word salawat, is a sound feminine plural. والفعل المضارع الذي لم يتصل بآخره شيء, and the fourth thing is the mudari verb, to the end of which nothing at all is attached. ومثاله يذهب من قولك يذهب محمد. So if you create a sentence يذهب محمد, يذهب would be the example of this. فيذهب فعل مضارع مرفوع. It's a mudari verb which is in rafa لتجرده من الناصب والجوازم, due to its being empty and stripped from the Naṣb giving and Jazm giving agents. So in other words, there's no particles before it that would do either of those two things. وعلامة رفعه الضمة الظاهرة, and the indicator of its rafa is the visible dhamma. ومحمد فاعل مرفوع, and this is not part of the example, but for the sake of completion, he tells you about Muhammad. He says Muhammad is a fa'il that's in rafa, وعلامة رفعه الضمة الظاهرة. Okay, now the author, he establishes the asl and speaks about anything that defies and violates the asl in two paragraphs. الأصل في إعراب ما يعرب بالحركات وما خرج عنه. The default within the grammatical reflection of those that are reflected through vowels, what's the default? وما خرج عنه, and what is it that violates or defies or is excluded from this normal way of being reflected. قال وكلها ترفع. The author, the muallif, he says, and all of them are supposed to be, and all of them should be reflected in rafa with dhamma. Or you can say, and all of them, their rafa is reflected with dhamma, their nasab is reflected with fatha, and their jar is reflected with kasra, and their jazm is reflected with sukun, with those distinctions that I mentioned in the earlier section of this video. وَخَرَجَ عَنْ ذَلِكَ ثَلَاثَةُ أَشْيَاء, and there's three things in particular that are excluded from what I just said. Okay, and there's subsections of the four categories. So it's not entire categories are excluded. There's subsections. So the sound feminine plural, 33% of the way it behaves defies the default. The change restricted word, 33% of the way it behaves defies the default. Okay, and the change restricted word is found among the ism mufrad, and it's also found among the jamu' taksir. Some of it's there, some of it's there. You see? Okay, so three things are excluded from this. What are they? جمع المؤنث السالم ينصب بالكسرة, the sound feminine plural, its nasab is reflected with kasra. والاسم الذي لا ينصرف, and the ism that is not fully declinable, regardless of whether it's a singular ism or a broken plural, يخفض بالفتحة, its jar is reflected with fatha. والفعل المضارع المعتل الآخر, and the mudari verb which has a weak last letter, يجزم بحذف آخره, its jazm is reflected with the omission of its last letter. وأقول, the commentator, he says, الأصل في الأشياء الأربعة التي تعرب بالحركات أن ترفع بالضمة. The default within those four things that are grammatically reflected through vowels is for their rafa to be reflected with dhamma. their Naṣb to be reflected with Fatha and their Jar to be reflected with Kasra. And if it's a verb and there's Jazm, then that Jazm to be reflected with Sukun. That's what we want. That's what we're expecting. That's the default. فَأَمَّا الرَّفْعُ بِالضَّمَّةِ. Okay, now the commentator, he proceeds and gives a bunch of examples. Okay, I guess we'll keep going with this. فَأَمَّا الرَّفْعُ بِالضَّمَّةِ. As for Rafa being reflected with Dhamma, فَإِنَّهَا كُلَّهَا قَدْ جَاءَتْ عَلَى مَا هُوَ الْأَصْلُ فِيهَا. Then all of these earlier four categories are occurring as they should be, as in accordance to the default. There's no violation. The violation doesn't happen in Dhamma reflecting Rafa. Actually, it does in the case of the Mudari verb, because if it's a weak lettered Mudari verb, then its Rafa is not reflected with Dhamma. So you could say, if you were to take the Mudari verb and conceivably it could end in a normal last letter or it could end in a weak letter. So let's assign a percentage. 50% of them are normal and 50% of them are weak lettered ones, and then the weak lettered ones could be alif or waw or ya. It doesn't really matter. Bottom line, actually he's right. Okay, I made a mistake. He's right. He's correct. Okay, because regardless of whether the mudari verb is sahihul akhir or mu'tallul akhir, Rafa is the reflection of Dhamma. Now it's besides the point that in the case of the sahihul akhir, the Rafa is with a Dhamma Zahira, and in the case of the Mu'tallil Akhir, the Rafa is with a Dhamma Muqaddara. So, but this entire distinction is unimportant as far as both the author and the commentator are concerned. So what he's saying here is accurate. So hopefully you found that segment a little valuable there. Where we paused and we talked about that. Okay, post in the comments. Let me know how you're finding these sessions, and if you appreciate the detail that I'm giving. Okay, and the pauses and trying to explain these things. Okay, so what is he saying here? Yeah, so all of them have occurred. قد جاءت, they are exactly as we would expect them to be. على ما هو الأصل فيها. They are in accordance to the asl that was established regarding them. فَرَفُوا جَمِيعِهَا بِالضَّمَّةِ. So the rafa of all of them is with dhamma. وَمِثَالُهَا. And the extended example is as follows. يسافر محمد والأصدقاء والمؤمنات. That Muhammad, the friends, and the Muslim women have all traveled. So over here we have an example of a mudari verb that is in Rafa, reflected with the Dhamma, and then we have an example of a mufrad ism that's in Rafa, reflected with the Dhamma Zahira. And over here we have a Jam'u Taksir. Al-Asdiqa is a Jam'u Taksir, and it's Rafa. And it's in Rafa too, but not because of fa'il, it's in Rafa because of ma'atuf on the fa'il. So it's extended because of the waw. And then al-mu'minat is ma'atuf number 2, and so therefore it's 2 is in Rafa. So we've determined that it is in Rafa, and then we're looking and seeing that the indicator is Dhamma. So this is an extended example that has 4 examples built into it, and the commentator neatly arranges all 4 categories into a single sentence. So it's pretty cool, right? فَيُسَافِرُ فِعْلٌ مُضَارِعٌ مَرْفُوعٌ لِتَجَرُّدِهِ مِنَ النَّاصِبِ وَالْجَازِم. So yusafir is a mudari verb that's in Rafa due to being stripped from the Naṣb giver and the Jazm giver. وَعَلَامَةُ رَفْعِهَا ضَمَّةُ ظَاهِرَةٌ. Okay? وَمُحَمَّدٌ فَاعِلٌ مَرْفُوعٌ وَعَلَامَةُ رَفْعِهِ ضَمَّةُ ظَاهِرَةٌ. Okay, so again, I'm not going to translate this. وَهُوَ اسْمٌ مُفْرَدٌ. And Muhammad happens to be an example of a ism mufrad. Yusafir was an example of a mudari verb, and Muhammad is an example of a ism mufrad. وَالْأَصْدِقَاءُ مَرْفُوعٌ. And al-asdiqa is also marfu', but he doesn't say fa'ilun marfu'un. On al-asdiqa, he doesn't say fa'ilun marfu'un, because the true fa'il is the first word. The second and third words, they are extended from the fa'il via the waw. So their rafa is because of tabi'a and not because of asalatan. Okay, so this is a distinction that the grammarians they make. But nonetheless, it's in Rafa. He says, لِأَنَّهُ مَعْتُوفٌ عَلَى الْمَرْفُوعِ, because it's extended via the waw from an earlier word, which is in Rafa, because of its own reason, which is the fa'il. Or you could just say it's part of the fa'il. وَعَلَامَةُ رَفْعِهِ الضَّمَّةُ الظَّاهِرَةُ. And the sign of al-asdiqa being in Rafa is the visible dhamma. وَهُوَ جَمْعُ تَكْسِيرٍ. And it is a broken plural. وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتُ مَرْفُوعٌ لِأَنَّهُ أَيْضًا معطوف على المرفوع. So this is like معطوف number 2, second معطوف. وعلامة رفعه ضمة ظاهرة وهو جمع مؤنث سالم. And here we have a sound feminine plural. وأما النصب بالفتحة, and as for نصب being reflected with fatha, فإنها كلها جاءت على ما هو الأصل فيها. So over here, the vast majority of them are in accordance to the default that we're expecting them to experience. So all of them have occurred according to the default that was established within them, ما عدا جمع المؤنث السالم, with the exception of the sound feminine plural. So the sound feminine plural is Naṣb is not reflected with fatha, but the rest of them are. Their Naṣb is reflected with fatha, including the weak lettered mudari verbs. يرضى and يدعو and يرمي. Okay? فإنه ينصب, because the sound feminine plural in particular, ينصب بالكسرة, is Naṣb reflected with kasra. Okay, so this is a little repetitive, but it's repetitive. The fact that it's repetitive is actually a good thing because it relieves you from having to watch the video multiple times. So you see what the author did, it's like memorizing without rote memorizing. Like you don't have to sit and memorize it like you would memorize a surah of the Quran. You don't have to do it that way. You just watch the videos, relax, watch the videos, and maybe come back to it a month later, 2 months later, and rewatch the entire series once more, and you got it, right? So the unpacking and being able to have this material delivered multiple times, once through the matan and then again through the sharh, and the fact that the commentator is not being stingy with his words. So his goal here is not to be efficient. So he's unpacking and he's elaborating to the point of being a little redundant as well. But I think that's okay. Again, you can comment and let me know about that in the comments if you agree with that sentiment. Let's continue. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying that the sound feminine plural violates the Naṣb with fatha. Everything else is in accordance to that default, and it's the sound feminine plural which is against it. Okay, why is it against it? Because its Naṣb is reflected with kasra, substituting for the fatha. ومثالها لن أخالف محمدا والأصدقاء والمؤمنات. Okay, so here the point of the example is that the mudari verb is in Naṣb, and the Naṣb is reflected with fatha, and over here we have a noun which is maf'ul bihi, which means it's also in Naṣb, and its Naṣb is reflected with the fatha. والأصدقاء والمؤمنات, and ma'tuf, and then والمؤمنات is in Naṣb as well, but al-mu'minat's Naṣb is not reflected with fatha, it's reflected with the kasra. Okay, so he says all of that. So I mean, this is like mind-numbing at this stage right now, but we'll just do it anyways. So he says فَأُخَالِفَ فِعْلٌ مُضَارِعٌ مَنْصُوبٌ مِلَن. So here we have an example of a mudari verb which is mansub because of the lan. وَعَلَامَةُ نَصْبِهِ الْفَتْحَةُ ظَاهِرَةٌ, and the indicator of the nasab is the visible fatha. خالفا fa that. ومحمدا مفعول به منصوب وعلامة نصبه الفتحة الظاهرة أيضا. So here too we have a visible fatha as an indicator of the nasab, which is what this entire section is about. That this category of ism is reflected via these indicators. Okay, so is it in accordance to the default, or does it defy and violate the default? Goes against it. وهو اسم مفرد, and it is a mufrad ism, in other words Muhammad, كما علمت, as you know from the unpacking that we did in the previous example in the earlier paragraph. والأصدقاء منصوب, and the word al-asdiqa is mansub لأنه معطوف على المنصوب, because of the extension reason. وعلامة نصبها الفتحة الظاهرة أيضا. Okay, here too the sign and the indicator of nasab is the visible fatha. وهو جمع تكسير كما علمت, and that's an example of a broken plural. والمؤمنات منصوب لأنه معطوف على المنصوب أيضا, so it's معطوف number 2. However, the difference is وعلامة نصبها الكسرة. The indicator of his nasab, instead of being a fatha, is a kasra, نيابة عن الفتحة, instead of being a fatha or substituting for the fatha. لأنه جمع مؤنث سالم, because it's a sound feminine plural. وأما الخفض, so again here وأما الخفض it's exactly the same. He's going to say that in khafd, first of all, the mudari verb doesn't experience khafd, so you can take that out of the equation to remove the mudari verb from the equation. Now from the 4 things that he talked about, they all are in accordance to the default, with the exception of the change restricted word, where the jar is not reflected with kasra, the jar is reflected with fatha. And this is what he's going to say. And he's going to give example, marartu bi, and then, no, not marartu. Marartu. He can use marartu because he's not trying to illustrate the verb, because this is jar and verbs don't experience jar, so you can use a madi verb for all we care in the example. Up there he intentionally used mudari verbs, ukhalif, because he was trying to highlight that the mudari's nasab is reflected with fatah. Lan ukhalifa. Marartu bi Muhammadin wal mu'minati wa ahmada. Okay, he's gonna say an example like that. Like, let's see what he does. Okay, so that's what I would expect him. He said, وَالرِّجَالِ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَالرِّجَالِ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ وَأَحْمَدٍ. Okay, broken plural. Okay, you see that? So وَأَمَّا الْخَفْضُ بِالْكَسْرَةِ فَإِنَّهَا كُلَّهَا قَدْ جَاءَتْ عَلَى مَا هُوَ الْأَصْلُ فِيهَا مَا عَدَى الْفِعْلَ الْمُضَارِعَ فَإِنَّهُ لَا يُخْفَضُ أصلا وَمَا عَدَى الْإِسْمَ الَّذِي لَا يَنْصَرِفْ فَإِنَّهُ يُخْفَضُ بِالْفَتْحَةِ نِيَابَةً عَنِ الْكَسْرَةِ, which is exactly what I just told you. As for jar being reflected with kasra, then all of the four categories that were listed above have occurred in accordance to the default within them. So they're in line with the way they're supposed to be, with the exception of two things. With the exception of the mudari verb, because it doesn't enter the equation. ما عدا الفعل المضارع. With the exception of the mudari verb, فإنه لا يخفض أصلا, because it doesn't experience jar at all. وما عدا الاسم الذي لا ينصرف, and also with the exception of the ism that's change restricted, فإنه يخفض بالفتحة, because its jar is reflected with fatha as a substitute for kasra. ومثالها, and the extended example is as follows: مررت بمحمد. So over here we have an ism mufrad, which is munsarif, jar being reflected with kasra. والرجال is the broken plural example. والمؤمنات is the sound feminine plural example, and clearly you can see all of the kasras. And then he tags on Ahmad. Wa Ahmada. So here Ahmad is in jar because of being ma'tuf number 3. Okay, on Muhammad. In other words, the ba preposition is influencing it. And then he says all of this. He says فَمَرَرْتُ فِعْلٌ وَفَاعِلٌ. So marartu is an example of both the verb as well as the fa'il. So it's not one word, it's two words. وَالْبَاءُ حَرْفُ خَفْض. And the ba is a preposition. وَمُحَمَّدٍ مَخْفُوضٌ بِالْبَاءِ. And Muhammad is in jar because of the ba. وَعَلَامَةُ خَفْضِهِ الْكَسَةُ الظَّاهِرَةُ. And the sign of its being in jar is the visible kasra. وَهُوَ اسْمٌ مُفْرَدٌ مُنْصَرِفٌ. So he doesn't just say it's a mufrad, he says it's a mufrad munsarif. So now this distinction is important. The distinction of whether in the rafa being reflected with dhamma, it wasn't important. In the Naṣb being reflected with fatah, it wasn't important. But now we're speaking about jar, so we don't say it's a mufrad, we say it's a mufrad munsarif, or we say ma la yansarif. So they're split and they're segmented, and this segmentation will occur in the broken plural as well. The broken plural, so he's not just going to say jam'u taksir, he's going to say jam'u taksir munsarif, jam'u taksir ghair munsarif, like that. Or maybe he doesn't, but in the extended example, he just brought the word al-rijal, and he brought it with an al. Okay, so even if it was change restricted, it would still receive a kasra, because even change restricted words, if they have al, then they do receive kasra, like wal masajidi. But if there's no al, then it becomes wal masajida, no kasra, no tanween. Okay, remember that from one of the earlier sessions? Okay, so this word Muhammad is a mufrad ism that's munsarif, kama arafta, as you know. وَالرِّجَالِ مَخْفُوضٌ. And the word al-rijal is in jar because it's ma'atuf on something which is in jar. So in other words, it has to match. وَعَلَامَةُ خَفْضِهِ الْكَسَةُ الظَّاهِرَةُ. And the indicator of his jar is the visible kasra. وَهُوَ جَمْعُ تَكْسِير munsarif. And al-rijal is an example of a broken plural which is munsarif, as you already know. Okay, but again, what rijal, even if it was change restricted, it will still receive a kasra, not because of what he's talking about, but because of the footnote. Okay, the footnote is that any change restricted word, if it's ever mudaf, or if it has an al before it, then it will receive kasra. So you see, so it's muddying the example somewhat. Having an al on a rijal, it's muddying the example, if that makes sense. But he says that regardless, he says وَهُوَ جَمْعُ تَكْسِير, and al-rijal is an example of a jam'u taksir, but not just any jam'u taksir. It's a broken plural which is fully declinable, كما عرفت أيضا, as you also know, as you've also come to know. والمؤمنات مخفوض لأنه معطوف على المخفوض أيضا, so it would be the second معطوف. وعلامة خفضه هي الكسرة الظاهرة, and the indicator of مؤمنات's jar is similarly a visible kasra, and it is a sound feminine plural كما عرفت أيضا, as you've also already come to know. وأحمد مخفوض, and Ahmad is in jar. They're all in jar, all four of them are in jar. لأنه معطوف, because it's معطوف number 3. So the very first one we say is in jar because of the preposition. The rest of them we say, the rest of them, talking about each one separately, we say this one's in jar because of معطوف number 1, معطوف number 2, معطوف number 3. That's how it's expressed. وعلامة خفضه الفتحة, and the indicator of its jar is the fatha. He's talking about Ahmad. نيابة عن الكسرة, substituting for the kasra, لأنه اسم لا ينصرف, because it's the ism that does not change fully. It doesn't experience tanween, no kasra, no tanween. In other words, it's change restricted. Okay, now for the sake of completion, he tells you the particular reason why Ahmad is change restricted. What's so special about it? It has to have 2 of the 9 causes. Remember, it has to. Yeah. So he says, وَالْمَانِعُ لَهُ مِنَ الصَّرْفِ, and the obstacle preventing it from receiving the full change is, number 1, the fact that it's a proper noun, and number 2, the fact that it's in the pattern of a verb. Okay, وَأَمَّا الْجَزْمُ بِالسُّكُونِ, and as for jazm being reflected with sukun, فَأَنْتَ تَعْلَمُ, you already know, أَنَّ الْجَزْمَ مُخْتَصٌ بِالْفِعْلِ الْمُضَارِعِ, you already know that jazm uniquely applies to the mudari verb, and it doesn't apply anywhere else. فإن كان صحيح الآخر, so if it's a mudari verb that has a normal last letter, فإن جزمه بالسكون, then its jazm will be with sukun كما هو الأصل في الجزم, which is in accordance to the default within jazm, as far as jazm is concerned. ومثاله لم يسافر خالد, Khalid did not travel. فلم حرف نفي وجزم قلب, so lam is a particle of negation, inducing jazm, okay, jazm giving, and flipping. Okay, so this is how they talk about the particles when they're doing i'rab, and when they're parsing and moving from right to left and talking about what's going on in terms of mu'rab and mabni, and they come across a particle, they'll label the particle. They won't say this is lam. They say lam is a particle of A, B, and C. So when describing a particle, whether it's inna, or whether it's the ba preposition, or whether it's lam or lan, or maybe hal, or whatever the particle, when you're going and you're talking about every word within the sentence, parsing it, then you want to highlight the feature and function of the particle, because every particle is unique from the rest of the particles by its feature and function. So feature and function would refer to the particular way in which it governs, and that's not true for all particles, because particles divided into governing agents, non-governing agents. So if it governs, then you want to speak about what it induces on the word that follows it. So is it a particle of jar? Is it a particle of naṣb? So over here he says lam is, and then the what it does to the meaning. So if the verb was affirmative, the lam comes along and negates it. So it's a particle of negation and jazm and flipping. So it takes the tense of the verb, which was present future, and it flips it back into the past. So lam, the way he describes it is pretty remarkable. He calls it a harfu nafin wa jazmin wa qalb. Now if it was lan, and he's moving from right to left and he needs to speak about lan, then he'll say harfu nafyin wa nasbin wa istiqbal, because part of the feature and function of lan is it takes the mudari verb and eliminates its present tense and restricts the verb to the future. So that's what lan is doing. It's negating the verb, it's causing naṣb to the verb. So some of its meaning level feature and function, and some of its word level feature and function. In other words, how does it alter the grammatical positioning of the word that follows it, whether that word is an ism or whether that word is a mudari verb. Okay, so I think that was just a bit of methodology, the way he does it. Okay, so keep that in mind. So he says falam, so lam is a harfu nafyin wa jazmin wa qalb. So it's a particle that did 3 things. Number 1, it negated. Number 2, it induced jazm, and number 3, it flipped the meaning of the verb from the present future to the past. because lam yusafir means did not travel, and it doesn't mean is not traveling. Okay, if you wanted to say is not traveling, you'd put a la at the front. La yusafiru Khalidun, and in that case, yusafir would have a dhamma because la is a non-governing agent. And if you wanted to say will not in the future, then you wouldn't use lam for that. You would say lan yusafira Khalidun. Khalid will never travel in the future. It also creates a bit of emphasis. Okay, but that's something that the ancient Arabian would just understand that, and I think that's fine. Okay, so فلم. Okay, ويسافر فعل مضارع مجزوم بلم. يسافر is a مضارع verb which is in jazm because of the lam. وعلامة جزمه السكون, and the indicator of its jazm is sukun. وخالد فاعل مرفوع وعلامة رفعه ضمة ظاهرة. Okay, that's not the point of the example. وإن كان الفعل المضارع معتل الآخر, and if the مضارع verb ends in a weak last letter, كان جزمه بحذف حرف علة, is jazm would be reflected with the omission of the حرف العلة of the weak letter. ومثاله, and the example of that is لم يسعى بكر. يسعى becomes لم يسعى بكر. Bakr did not strive. ولم يدعو ولم يقضي ما عليه, and did not invite, and neither did he fulfill the responsibilities that were upon him. So he strings up three mudari verbs, all of them in jazm, all of them weak, all of them having lost their last letter. And in one case, the alif, when it drops, it leaves behind a fatha as a clue and as evidence. And over here the waw was dropped, and the evidence and the proof of that is that it left behind the dhamma. Yad'u becoming lam yad'u. And over here the ya dropped and left behind a kasra. So this is what he'll say now. فَكُلٌّ مِّن يَسْعَ وَيَدْعُ وَيَقْضِي فِعْلٌ مُضَارِعٌ. So each one of them is a mudari verb مجزوم بلم. وعلامة جزمه حذف الألف من يسع. And the indicator of the jazm is the omission of the alif from the word yas'a. والفتة قبلها دليل عليها. And the preceding fatha is proof and evidence of that, of the dropped alif. وحذف الواو, and وحذف الواو, and the sign and the indicator of jazm is the omission of the waw in the case of yad'u, and the dhamma prior to it is the proof and evidence of that. وحذف الياء من يقضي, and the omission of the ya in yaqdi, and the kasra before it is an indication and proof of that. And I think we'll end this session here, and we'll continue in a new video for al-mu'rabat bil-huruf. Okay, وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so we're now continuing with this this section on the mu'rabat, the words in the language that experience i'rab. So having completed talking about the words in the language that are grammatically reflected with vowels, the commentator now quotes the author speaking about those words that are grammatically reflected by letters. And he says that they too are four categories: the dual, the sound masculine plural, the five isms, and the five verbs. يفعلان تفعلان يفعلون تفعلون تفعلين. Okay, so here's what he says. المعربات بالحروف, those words that are grammatically reflected via letters. قال والذي يعرب بالحروف, the author, the muallif, he says, and those words which are grammatically reflected through letters are of four categories. أربعة أنواع. التثنية, the dual, وجمع المذكر السالم, and the sound masculine plural. والأسماء الخمسة, and the five isms, أبوك أخوك etc. والأفعال الخمسة, the five verbs, and by that he's referring to يفعلان وتفعلان ويفعلون وتفعلون وتفعلين. وأقول, the commentator says, القسم الثاني من المعربات الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف. The second category of those words which experience grammatical positioning are those that receive their grammatical reflection through letters, are the things which receive their grammatical reflection through letters. الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف. والحروف التي تكون علامة على الإعراب أربعة. And the particular letters which can serve as an indicator for grammatical positioning are four. وهي الألف والواو والياء والنون, and they are alif, waw, ya, and nun. So before continuing forward, pause the video. Where does the alif occur? Where does the waw occur? Where does the ya occur? Where does the noon occur? Okay, so basically the alif would occur in the dual in Rafa, Rajulani. The waw would occur in the Jama Mudhakkar Salim in Rafa, Muslimuna. The ya would occur in Naṣb and Jar for both the dual as well as the sound masculine plural, Rajulaini and Muslimina. The noon would occur as an indicator for Jazm, as an indicator for Rafa in the Mudari verb, al-af'al al-khamsa. وَالَّذِي يُعْرَبُ بِهَذِهِ الْحُرُوفِ أَرْبَعَةُ أَشْيَاء. And the particular words that are grammatically reflected through these four letters are four things. التثنية والمراد بها المثنى. And what's intended by al-tathniya is the dual. Okay, so التثنية means duality. Like if you look at the word duality, so he's saying it's not being used in the masdar meaning, it's being used in the meaning of the dual, adjective. وَالْمَرَادُ بِهَا الْمُثَنَّى. Okay, so he's speaking about the technical dual, and he's also speaking about other things that resemble the technical dual, although they don't fit the definition because they don't have a singular. In order to be a dual, it has to have a singular, where the only addition was the alif and the noon, or the ya and the noon, that created the meaning of dual. And you should be able to expand it and be left with something meaningful. Okay, in order to be a technical dual. So if you say rajulani, that's the equivalent of rajulun wa rajulun. It's an abbreviated and more efficient way of saying rajulun wa rajulun. So atfu mithlihi alayhi. So this was all talked about in the previous sessions. What exactly is a dual? What's the definition for the dual? Anything that doesn't fit the definition of a dual and yet is reflected in the similar way that the dual is reflected, we call that mulhaq bil muthanna. So we have the muthanna, we have the mulhaq bil muthanna. Both the author, the muallif, and also the commentator at this stage right now is not going into that distinction about technical versus something that merely looks like a dual. Bottom line is that we have alif noon that's used for rafa, alif, and ya for the nasab and jar. Or bottom line is that the first of the four categories of words that experience reflection through letters is the dual. ومثاله المصراني والمحمداني والبكراني والرجلاني. The two cities, the two Muhammads, the two Bakrs, and the two men. So there's some condition. There's actually the definition for the dual has passed already. Like it came earlier in the book, so we don't have to speak too much about it right now. Number two, جمع المذكر السالم, the sound masculine plural. ومثال والمسلمون والبكرون والمحمدون. الأسماء الخمسة, the five isms, وهي أبوك وأخوك وحموك وفوك وذو مال. Number four, الأفعال الخمسة, the five verbs, the mudari verbs that have the pronouns attached to them, the alif or the waw or the ya. ومثالها, and their examples are يضربان وتكتبان ويفهمون وتفهمون وتسهرين. So he gives five examples using five different verbs: hitting and writing and understanding and memorizing, and tasharina, staying awake at night, and you stay awake at night, speaking to a female. وسيأتي بيان وإعراب كل واحد من هذه الأشياء الأربعة تفصيلا. And the detailed explanation of the grammatical reflection of each one of these four things is coming shortly, will come shortly. Okay, so when I translated the word i'rab here, I said the detailed grammatical reflection of each one of these, not the detailed grammatical positioning, because there's a difference between grammatical positioning and grammatical reflection. Grammatical positioning will be talked about in the last third of the book, when he goes into the roles of the ism. Al-marfu'atu wal-mansūbatu wal-majrūratu. Right now, we don't even know the reasons why a particular ism would be in rafa. He hasn't told us that yet. Okay, yet the commentator, when he does i'rab of examples, he speaks about fa'ilun marfu'un, or he says this particular word is in jar because of the harf before it, because of the harf ba before it, right? So there's like 8, 12, and 2 is the count that we use, the way that we categorize the roles of the ism. So all of that is yet to be talked about. Okay, so it's worth reminding that this grammatical positioning, the roles, is actually the thing that should have been taught first. So when we teach beginners, we don't talk about reflection. We don't talk about reflection for a great number of weeks, like half halfway into the semester. It's only the particular things that start appearing within the book, like Nasihatu Ibrahima, Ibrahim al-Islam's advice. So over there we'll speak a little about Ibrahim. But maybe the first instance we would ignore it completely. And we would suppress it and avoid it. And then when something similar comes 2, 3, 4 times, then we'll say that, okay, within the nouns, there's a subset of isms, they don't receive full reflection. Instead of dhamma, fatha, kasra, they have dhamma and the fatha is used twice. Okay, and where does that happen? That happens in feminine names. It happens in foreign names. It happens in names of countries and cities. It happens in a lot of adjectives, particularly those that are on the pattern of a verb. Adjectives that have alif nun at the end of them. And it happens in certain plurals, certain broken plurals that fit a particular definition that will be taught later. Okay, so that's like a brief summary of this topic of change restriction. So that's change restriction is a subtopic of reflection. Okay, that's the point I'm trying to get across right now. Change restriction is not grammar proper. It's not. It doesn't belong to the core of grammar. It's something that a student eventually would want to know. But if you see certain things that defy the dhamma, fatha, kasra, sukun reflection, don't worry about it. Just say discussion number 3. Okay, this is the way we do it. We say discussion. We actually name it that, discussion number 3. So in order to suggest that it's third in terms of importance. So the reason why this book is confusing and the reason why people get overwhelmed by this book is it flips the order of what's important. Okay, so understanding the roles of the isms and being able to take long sentences and segment those sentences into their major portions is infinitely more important than understanding the case endings. Okay, just dhamma, fatha, kasra, you're good. Like 90% of the time, that's what it's going to be. Anything that defies that are certain categories of isms that would defy that. Okay, like what he's doing here, I like it. What the author and the commentator is doing right here is like the earlier section of the book, I would say is completely unnecessary. In order to go indicator by indicator, going state by state, or rafa, and rafa is reflected through this, and mention all the total possible ways that rafa could be indicated by dhamma, which happens here, waw, which happens here, alif, which happens here. I mean, it's useful, but the usefulness of it is third in the list of what's more important. So this is why 80-20 is incredibly important. That's why our program, alhamdulillah, is very successful. Because I figured these things out years ago. And intuitively, this is how I've been teaching. And if you're following us in this series of YouTube videos, maybe you're also getting an appreciation of what we did there. Exactly how revolutionary it was what we did. Alhamdulillah. Pretty remarkable. Alhamdulillah. Okay, continuing. So you have to make this distinction about grammatical reflection versus grammatical positioning. Grammatical positioning is the roles and the ways in which the word is used, and that's infinitely more important than being able to memorize or being able to list from memory all the possible indicators of rafa, all the possible indicators of naṣb, and the indicators of jar, etc., etc. Okay, at any rate, that was the tangent. Hopefully it wasn't too long. Let's continue. إعراب المثنى, the grammatical reflection of the dual, not positioning, grammatical reflection of the dual. How is it done? قال فأما التثنية فترفع بالألف وتنصب وتخفض بالياء. He says, the author, the muallif, he says that as for the dual, its rafa is reflected through alif, and its naṣb and its jar are both reflected through ya. وأقول الأول من الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف التثنية. I say that the first of the things which are grammatically reflected through letters is the dual. وهي المثنى, and التثنية here is referring to المثنى كما علمت, as we just told you a minute ago. وقد عرفت فيما سبق تعريف المثنى, and in the earlier section of the book you've also come to recognize the definition of the مثنى. Okay, so it's anything that indicates on two by way of the addition of an alif or a ya, and it's capable of tajreed, it's capable of the ending being removed, so it's a removable ending, it's not permanent, and it's also capable of عطف مثله عليه, capable of taking the like of it and making it ma'duf on it. So qamarani, for example, which is a reference to the sun and the moon. The Arab people, when they're referring to the sun and the moon, they don't ash-shamsu wal qamar, but then they say qamarani, the two moons, but they're not really two moons, it's a sun and a moon. But or like abawan, which is a very common word that's used for parents. Abawan literally means two fathers, but the intent there is not abun wa abun. The intent there is abun wa ummun. So technically, abawani and qamarani would not be duals, but they have the same reflection as a dual, so they would be included in the short list of mulhaqat, something which is mulhaq bil muthanna and not technically muthanna, or not muthanna haqiqatan. Okay, so that's a distinction that other books explain, like Ibn Aqil and these other books, they talk about these things. And in the Hidayat al-Nahwu book, when he lists the 16 types of isms, the reason why that number is larger is because these mulhaqat are listed separately. Kila wa kilta would be mulhaq bil muthanna, and ithnani wa ithnatani would be a separate category of mulhaq bil muthanna, because kila and kilta are dual in terms of the meaning, but since they don't have a singular and there's no addition that's removable, so that's why it would need to be listed separately. And ithnani wa ithnatani are not even dual. Like the word ithnani is not dual. Ithnani means two, but it doesn't mean two twos, it just means two. In other words, the number two, the number that's between 1 and 3, that number. Okay, which is a notion, and it's a quantity. Okay, does that make sense? Right. Okay, so that's to do with the ta'rif of the muthanna, the technical definition of the muthanna. I just reminded you of certain things that were spoken about in the previous sessions. Let's continue. وَحُكْمُهُ أَن يُرْفَعَ بِالْأَلِفِ نِيَابَةً عَنِ الضَّمَّةِ. And the ruling of the dual is for its rafa to be reflected with alif in substitution for the dhamma. وَيُنْصَبُ وَيُخْفَضُ. And its nasab and its jar to be reflected with a particular kind of ya. With the ya, that before which is maftuh, that after which is maksur. In other words, the letter that's immediately preceding it has a fatha, and the letter that's immediately following the ya has a kasra, rajulaini. Niyabatan an al-fathati aw al-kasrati, either as a substitute, either in substitution for the fatha or in substitution for the kasra. Okay, so, and then he says وَيُوصَلُ بِهِ, and to it will be attached. And to this alif and to this ya will be attached, he says that بعد الألف أو الياء, to the word after the alif or after the ya will be attached a nunun, a particular nun, تكون عوضا عن التنوين, which is a sort of replacement for the tanween, الذي يكون في الاسم المفرد, which was there or which should have been there in the case of the singular ism. ولا تحذف هذه النون, and this nun will not be omitted إلا عند الإضافة, except at the time of the word becoming mudaf. Now it's different than the tanween, because tanween would drop if there's an al as well. So rajulun has a tanween, or ghulamun has a tanween, and if you make it mudaf and say ghulamuka or ghulamu zaydin, tanween goes away. If you put an al on ghulamun and say al ghulamu, then again the tanween goes away. This noon only goes away at the time of idafa. If you put a al, the noon's still there. So it's not exactly the equivalent of the tanween in the singular, but it's sort of like a compensation, because it can't have it, so at least it should have something. Okay, so that's what he's saying here when he says عوضا عن التنوين الذي يكون في الاسم المفرد. But then he adds the extra caveat that ولا تحذف هذه النون, this noon will not be omitted except at the time of becoming mudaf, whereas over there the tanween would drop with the al as well. فمثال المثنى المرفوع, so the example of the muthanna, the dual, which is in the state of rafa, is حضر القاضيان, the two judges arrived. وقال رجلان, and the two men said. فكل من القاضيان ورجلان مرفوع, so each of these is in rafa. لأنه فاعل, because it's a fa'il for the preceding verb. Each one has its own preceding verb. وعلامة رفعه الألف, and the sign or the indicator of its rafa is the alif. نيابة عن الضمة, in substitution for the dhamma, لأنه مثنى, because it's a dual and that's how duals are reflected. والنون عوض عن التنوين, and the noon is a replacement for the tanween within the singular ism في الاسم المفرد. ومثال المثنى المنصوب, and the example of the dual in the state of Naṣb is أحب المؤدبين وأكره المتكاسلين. I love the two people which are well mannered, and I dislike those that are incredibly lazy. Those two that are incredibly lazy. وأكره المتكاسلين. فكل من المؤدبين والمتكاسلين منصوب لأنه مفعول به, because in these particular examples the two isms are occurring as مفعول به. وعلامة نصبه الياء المفتوح ما قبلها المكسور ما بعدها, and the indicator of its nasab is the ya the letter before which is maftuh, and the letter after which is maksur. Okay, niyabatan, in other words, not just any ya, but this particular ya that has this configuration in terms of the letter before it as well as in terms of the letter that's following it. So the letter before has a kasra, the letter following has a fatha, meaning the noon has a fatha. Mu'addabain, the letter before has a fatha and the letter following has a kasra, the noon has a kasra. And this is in substitution for the fatha that should have been there for the singular ism. The singular ism would have had a fatha and the dual has a ya. لأنه مثنى. والنون عوض عن التنوين, and the noon is a compensation for the tanween within the singular ism. ومثال المثنى المخفوض, and the example of the مجرور مثنى is نظرت إلى الفارسين على الفرسين. I looked towards the two horsemen mounted on the two horses. So الفارسين الفرسين. فكل من الفارسين والفرسين مخفوض. So each one of these is in jar لدخول حرف الخفض عليه, due to the preposition coming before them. So al-farisain has the ila before it, and al-farasain has the ala before it, and they're both prepositions. وعلامة خفضه, and the indicator of its jar is the ya, that before which is maftu, that following which is maksur. نيابة عن الكسرة, in substitution for the kasra, لأنه مثنى, because these are examples of duals, and that's how duals are reflected. والنون عوض عن التنوين في الاسم المفرد, and again the noon is a compensation for the tanween which should have been in the singular ism. إعراب جمع المذكر السالم, the grammatical reflection of the sound masculine plural. قال وأما جمع المذكر السالم. Okay, so it's not so over here the word in the middle is in jar. جمع المذكر is مضاف إليه. جمع المذكر السالم, and salim is describing plural. In other words, the intact plural of the masculine. The intact plural of the masculine as opposed to the broken plural of the masculine. جمع المذكر السالم. And similarly, جمع المؤنث السالم. فيرفع بالواو وينصب ويخفض بالياء. So as for the sound masculine plural, its rafa is reflected with a waw, and its nasab and jar are both reflected with a ya. So the waw is al-madmumi ma qablaha, and the ya is al-maksuri ma qablaha, al-maftuhi ma ba'daha. Okay, he's going to say that. I'm not going to translate it every time now. Let's move a little more swiftly now. وأقول الثاني من الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف. The second of those things which are grammatically reflected through letters is the جمع المذكر السالم. وقد عرفت فيما سبق تعريف جمع المذكر السالم. And in the earlier section of the book, you've already recognized and come to know of the precise definition for the sound masculine plural. Okay, so the thing with the sound masculine plural that you need to keep in mind is that it has to be human beings. Sound masculine plurals are not objects. Sound feminine plural can be. Sound feminine plural, you can say trees, shajarat, or you could do it for like jannat, and it doesn't just have to be women. But sound masculine plurals have to be like actual men. And then there's other conditions as well that need to be satisfied, talked about in more detailed books. Anything that is receiving the reflection of the Jamu Mudhakkar Salim but technically does not fit the definition will be considered mulhaq. And examples will be those numbers, multiples of 10 from 20 to 90, which aren't even plurals. And also examples of something that's mulhaq will be the word ahlun, which is the plural of the word ahl, or the word illiyun, which is which is the highest level of paradise. It's not even plural, illiyun, but it's illiyun, illiyin. So it receives the same kind of ending that a Jamu Mudhakkar Salim receives. And ulu is an example as well, which is the plural of du, which is a different word altogether. So in order to be Jamu Mudhakkar Salim, technically the pattern of the singular should be intact. Okay, so that's something that the commentator talked about in the earlier section of the book, but at this stage right now, neither him nor the author is concerned about these mulhaqat. They're only talking about anything that receives this reflection. We're going to lump it all together and call it Jam'ul Mudhakkar Salim. وحكمه أن يرفع بالواو نيابة عن الضمة, and its ruling is for its rafa to be reflected with waw in substitution for the dhamma. وينصب ويخفض بالياء المكسور ما قبلها المفتوح ما بعدها, and its nasab and jar to both be reflected by this particular kind of ya. نيابة عن الفتحة, in substitution for the fatha or for the kasra. ويوصل به, and to it will be attached after the waw or after the ya, a noon which is a compensation for the tanween within the mufrad ism. ويوصل به بعد الواو أو الياء نون تكون عوضا عن التنوين في الاسم المفرد. وتحذف هذه النون, and here as well the noon will be omitted عند الإضافة كنون المثنى, exactly like the noon of the dual. فمثال جمع المذكر السالم المرفوع فمثال جمع المذكر السالم المرفوع, and the example of the مرفوع sound masculine plural is حضر المسلمون وأفلح الآمرون بالمعروف. The Muslim men arrived and those that enjoin the good are successful. So each of these two words فكل من المسلمون والآمرون is مرفوع لأنه فاعل, because they're occurring as a fa'il of the verbs that are immediately preceding them. وعلامة رفعه, and the indicator of its rafa is the waw نيابة عن الضمة لأنه جمع مذكر سالمون, because it's a sound masculine plural, and this is how sound masculine plurals are reflected in rafa with a waw. والنون عوض عن التنوين في الاسم المفرد. Continuing, ومثال جمع المذكر السالم المنصوب, and the example of the Manṣūb sound masculine plural is رأيت المسلمين واحترمت الآمرين بالمعروف, and I gave respect and I honored those that enjoin the good. فكل من المسلمين والآمرين منصوب. So in these two examples, each one of these two words, al-muslimin and al-amirin, is mansub because it's mafu bihi, and the indicator of its nasab is the ya, particular ya. Al-ya al-maksur ma qablaha, the letter before which is maksur, the letter after which is maftuh. لأنه جمع مذكر سالم, because it's a sound masculine plural, and that's how it's reflected in nasab. والنون عوض عن التنوين في الاسم المفرد. So again, the commentator's not being efficient. He's not counting his words. He's just laying it out, even at the risk of being repetitive. ومثال جمع المذكر السالم المخفوض, and the example of the majrur sound masculine plural is اتصلت بالآمرين بالمعروف. I came in contact with those that enjoin the good. ورضي الله عن المؤمنين, and Allah is pleased with the believing men. فكل من الآمرين والمؤمنين. In these two examples, each one of the two words al-amirin and al-mu'minin is in jar لدخول حرف الخفض عليه, because of the entry of the preposition prior to it. وعلامة خفضه, and the indicator of its khafd and the indicator of its jar is the particular ya المكسور ما قبلها المفتوح ما بعدها لأنه جمع مذكر سالم والنون عوض عن التنوين في الاسم المفرد. And here too the noon is a compensation for the tanween. إعراب الأسماء الخمسة, the grammatical reflection of the 5 isms. قال وأما الأسماء الخمسة. Okay, so certain people, they have this thing about, if you're teaching Arabic grammar, the medium of instruction has to be Arabic. Like, you can't teach in English. If you teach in English, then somehow you're doing a disservice to the students. I say that's all nonsense. Okay? Because the point here is to understand what he's saying. Okay? Because there's a logic and there's a structure to the language. And if a person doesn't already know Arabic, then you got to be able to communicate that to them, and you communicate that to them in the language that they understand. So when I take the word i'rab and sometimes translate it as grammatical positioning and sometimes translate it as grammatical reflection, then this is meaningful, and this is a distinction that if I was teaching in Arabic I would not be able to communicate that, except I'd have to use like a lot of sentences. You see that? So there's value in translating, and what makes an instructor, or what makes a teaching methodology superior or better, is not the fact that it's being taught in English. I mean, that's completely unrelated. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, right? إعراب الأسماء الخمسة, the grammatical reflection of the 5 isms. How are they reflected? Okay, we already know it's through letters, but now he's getting into more detail and is telling us which letters in particular are used. And he doesn't establish here a default and a substitution, because the default in the substitution, according to this commentator, is the dhamma fatha kasra. Okay, even the letter-based ones, they would be understood as substituting for the dhamma. So we have a waw substituting for the dhamma, we have an alif substituting for the fatha, and we have a ya substituting for the kasra, and that's what he'll say here. قال وأما الأسماء الخمسة, as for the 5 isms, فترفع بالواو, their rafa is reflected with waw, وتنصب بالالif, and their nasab is reflected with alif, and their jar is reflected with a ya. So we have a unique letter for each of the 3 states. وأقول الثالث من الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف الأسماء الخمسة. The third of the things which are grammatically reflected through letters is this category of the five isms. وقد سبق بيانها, and their detailed explanation has already occurred. Look what he says now. وقد سبق بيانها وبيان شروط إعرابها هذا الإعراب. وبيان شروط إعرابها هذا الإعراب. How would you translate that? Pause the video, think about it. وقد سبق بيانها وبيان شروط إعرابها هذا الإعراب. Huh? Okay, let me tell you. Okay, so he's saying the third from the things that are grammatically reflected through letters is the five isms, and an explanation of what they are has already preceded. And similarly, an explanation of the conditions of their, T-H-E-I-R, of their being grammatically reflected through this method of reflection has already preceded. So again, he uses the term i'rab like multiple times, but when I'm translating it in English, I have to use English in order to be able to communicate to you exactly what he means. Okay, so the هذا الإعراب is مفعول مطلق, and it's explaining the manner of being reflected, because words are reflected in different ways. So مفعول مطلق is going to come later in the book. They call it a masdar, and it's one of the 22 possible ways an ism could be used. It explains the way in which something is happening. So I sat in the sitting posture of the reciter, or I sat in the tashahhud position, or I sat cross-legged, right? So you would use a maf'ul mutlaq to communicate that. So وَبَيَانُ شُرُوطُ إِعْرَابِهَا, and explaining the conditions for its grammatical reflection in this, using this particular method, through this particular method of reflection, have already proceeded. In other words, they have to be singular. The five isms, they have to be singular. If they're dual, then they won't receive the waw, alif, and ya method of reflection. They'll receive the method of reflection which is assigned to the dual. In other words, رَجُلَانِ رَجُلَيْنِ أَبَوَانِ أَبَوَيْنِ أَخَوَانِ أَخَوَيْنِ. And they have to not be on their own, they have to be mudaf, because if they're on their own, then it will be dhamma fatha kasa ja'ani abun, ra'aytu aban, marartu bi abin. And they have to be mudaf to not the ya first person, because if they're mudaf to the ya first person, then the i'rab would be muqaddar, it would be understood, and it wouldn't be reflected at all because of the ya necessitating kasa ja'ani abi, ra'aytu abi, marartu bi abi. So this is what he's talking about when he says this. وحكمها, and its ruling, and their ruling, the ruling of these five isms, أن ترفع بالواو, is for all of them to be reflected with waw in rafa, in substitution for the dhamma, and for their nasab to be reflected with alif in substitution for the fatha, وتخفض بالياء, and for their jar to be reflected with ya in substitution for the kasra. فمثال الأسماء الخمسة المرفوعة. So the example of the five isms which are in rafa is as follows. إذا أمرك أبوك فأطيعه وحضر أخوك من سفره. When your father commands you, then obey him. إذا أمرك أبوك فأطيعه وحضر أخوك, and your father arrived, and your brother arrived from his travel. فكل من أبوك وأخوك. So each one of these two words, أبوك وأخوك, is in rafa مرفوع لأنه فاعل, because it's fa'il. وعلامة رفعه الواو, and the indicator of its rafa is the waw in substitution for the dhamma. لأنه من الأسماء الخمسة, because it belongs to this category of five isms. والكاف مضاف إليه, and the kaf at the end of abuka, and also the kaf at the end of akhuka, which is not the point of the example, but he's doing i'rab for the purpose of consistency, because he does it always. The commentator Sheikh Muhammad Muhyiddin Abdul Hamid, he's saying that the kaf is mudaf ilayh, and it's mabni on fatha. So in other words, the ka having a fatha is not significant. We know it's in jar, it's in the place of jar because of the way it's being used in the sentence, and there's no indicator for it. So the fatha on the kaf is not the indicator for the jar, it's just a mabni vowel, because that's the way it's built. Mabniun al fathi fi mahalli khafd. However, it's understood to be, it's in the place of jar. So it's just the way they express it. When something is literally majroor, they say makhfud, or they say majroor. And if it's a mabni that's experiencing jar, they don't say majroor or makhfud, they say fi mahalli khafd, or fi mahalli al-jar. ومثال الأسماء الخمسة المنصوبة, and the example of the five isms which are in Naṣb is أطيع أباك, obey your father, وأحبب أخاك, and love your brother. فكل من أباك وأخاك منصوب. So each one of these two isms is in Naṣb لأنه مفعول به, because it's a مفعول به for the verbs that are immediately preceding them. وعلامة نصبه الألف, and the indicator of its Naṣb is the alif نيابة عن الفتحة, substituting for the fatha, لأنه من الأسماء الخمسة, because it belongs to the 5 isms. والكاف مضاف إليه مبني على الفتح في محل جر قد كما سبق, as preceded. Same deal with the kaf, it's in jar on the basis of مضاف إليه and is mabni on fatha. ومثال الأسماء, so word endings are always talked about. Okay, so according to this methodology of this commentator, he speaks about word endings regardless of the word endings being significant grammatically, in other words, being an indicator of rafa, nasab, and jar, or the word ending simply being because that's the way it's built. So they talk about it. Like when we teach our students in the premium program, like when we come across these things, we don't draw attention to these things. Okay, so it seems a bit redundant, and the level of importance of these things is way lower on the scale. Like, I mean, you could be oblivious to these things and still be able to appreciate the meaning of the sentence. So what's more important than this is to be able to count the number of words, like in a long sentence, and be able to identify hidden pronouns within verbs, because the verb will either be empty or be carrying a pronoun. So how do you figure that out? And then eventually being able to segment the sentence into its major portions based on phrase level relationships. So this is the heart of grammar. This is what grammar is all about, right? And case endings and dhamma fatha, and whether it's a fixed dhamma or whether it's a significant dhamma, these things they don't belong to the heart of grammar, if that makes sense. Okay, but what he's saying is not useless. What he's saying is useful, but its usefulness and its level of importance is much later compared to the other things that are more important. So again, if you haven't already watched that 3-hour workshop, then I would strongly suggest you watch it, and maybe even come back to it and rewatch it again a couple of times over the next few months, inshallah. Okay, so let's continue with this. ومثال الأسماء الخمسة المخفوضة, and the example of the 5 isms in jar is استمع إلى أبيك, listen carefully to your father, وأشفق على أخيك, and have compassion on your brother, for your brother. فكل من أبيك وأخيك مخفوض لدخول حرف الخفض عليه, because of the preposition coming before it. وعلامة خفضه الياء, and the indicator of the khafd in this case is the ya, in substitution for the kasra, لأنه من الأسماء الخمسة, because these isms belong to the 5 isms, and that's how the 5 isms are reflected. In jar they're reflected with a ya. والكاف مضاف إليه كما سبق, and here too the kaf is a مضاف إليه as preceded, similar to what just passed, كما سبق. إعراب الأفعال الخمسة, and the grammatical positioning of the 5 verbs. Okay, now we're done with the 5 isms, and now the 5 verbs, in other words مضارع verbs. قال وأما الأفعال الخمسة فترفع بالنون وتنصب وتجزم بحذفها. And as for the 5 verbs, their rafa is reflected with the noon, and their nasab and jazm are reflected with the omission of the noon. وأقول الرابع من الأشياء التي تعرب بالحروف. I say that the 4th of the things that are grammatically reflected with letters would be this category of the 5 verbs. الأفعال الخمسة وقد عرفت فيما سبق, and you've already come to know in the earlier sections of the book حقيقة الأفعال الخمسة, the reality of the 5 verbs. What exactly is being referred to when we say الأفعال الخمسة? يفعلان تفعلان يفعلون تفعلون تفعلين, these 5. وحكمها, and their ruling is أنها ترفع بثبوت النون. Their ruling is that their rafa will be reflected with the presence of the noon, نيابة عن الضمة, in substitution for the dhamma. So the يفعل has a dhamma, and over here these ones don't have dhamma, they have a noon instead. وتنصب وتجزم, and their nasab and their jazm is reflected بحذف هذه النون, by the omission of this same noon, نيابة عن الفتحة, in substitution for the fatha, or in substitution for the sukun, depending on whether it's nasab or jazm. Okay, now, this is like really, really redundant. Okay, but it's not that much. We'll just get through it and we're done. And then we're done with this section. فمثال الأفعال الخمسة المرفوعة, so the example of the 5 verbs in rafa is تكتبان وتفهمان. فكل منهما, so each one of these is a فعل مضارع مرفوع. And the reason for the rafa is لتجرده من الناصب والجازم, due to its being stripped and empty of the nasb giving agent as well as the jazm giving agent. In other words, there's no lan before it, and there's no sister of lan. There's no lam, and there's no sister of lam before it. So when it's on its own, the mudari verb is supposed to be in rafa. وعلامة رفعه, and the indicator of its rafa is the presence of the nun. ثبوت النون. والألف ضمير الاثنين, and the alif in taktubani in tafhamani is the pronoun of the two men or the two women, or you could just say the pronoun of the dual is the fa'il. Okay, the pronoun of the dual is the fa'il, and it's mabni on sukun in the place of rafa. ومثال الأفعال الخمسة المنصوبة لن تحزن ولن تفشل. The two of you will never grieve, and the two of you will never lose. Okay, فكل منهما فعل مضارع منصوب بلن, منصوب because of the lan. وعلامة نسبه, and the indicator of its nasb is the omission of the nun. والألف ضمير الاثنين فاعل مبني على السكون في محل رفع, exactly like the previous. ومثال الأفعال الخمسة المجزومة, and the example of the 5 verbs in Jazm is لم تذاكرا ولم تفهما. The two of you did not study, and the two of you did not understand. فكل منهما فعل مضارع مجزوم بلم. So each one of these is a mudari verb that's in Jazm because of the lam. وعلامة جزمه حذف النون, and the indicator of its Jazm is the omission of the nun. والألف ضمير الاثنين فاعل مبني على السكون في محل رفع, exactly like the previous. Okay, and then he has some exercises which we'll skip, which we always skip, and then I mean, you can go through it on your own if you want. And then there's some questions which we'll also skip for the sake of time. And we are now done with this section. And in the next video, we'll read from the matan about the verbs and the categories of verbs. And then we'll go through the commentary, and we'll wrap this up maybe in 2 more sessions. And that's it. And then we'll make all of this available to you. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so now we're moving into the section on verbs, and this is just 1 page in the matan. So we'll read the matan, and then we'll move straight into the commentary. And here you're going to be exposed to all of the agents of Naṣb and Jazm, those particular particles that can come before the mudari verb and induce within it Naṣb, or cause it to enter into the state of Naṣb, which would then be reflected with fatha. And similarly, all of the particles and isms, there's also some isms that can come before the mudari verb and cause jazm. So what are they? What are their meanings? What are their features and functions? So this will all be talked about in the commentary. So the author, the muallif, he just lists them, but he doesn't tell you what they mean, and he doesn't tell you what their feature and function is. So this will probably be 2 or 3 more videos, and then we're done with this segment. So let's begin. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. He said, Babul Af'ali, the chapter on the verbs. الأفعال ثلاثة, the verbs are of 3 types: ماضٍ ومضارع وأمر, the perfect, the imperfect, and the command. نحو ضرب ويضرب واضرب. So ضرب ويضرب واضرب. Okay, so earlier in the beginning of the book, in one of the first lessons, it talked about the definition of a verb. What is a verb? What are the categories of the verb? What are the signs of how to recognize the verb? So several signs were listed, like قد and sin and sofa, and the ta'u ta'nith is sakina. And in the case of the mudari verb, it would, in the case of the amr, it would be indication on talab coupled with the attachment of the nun of emphasis. And these things, so we already know what a verb is, and we know what the madi and the mudari and the amr are. He gave the 3 examples: daraba wa yadribu wadrib. Okay, now with respect to the grammar of the verb, so he says فالماضي مفتوح الآخر أبدا. So the madi, its last letter will always have a fatha. So when he says its last letter will always have a fatha, and he uses the term مفتوح الآخر, he's suggesting that it's mabni. So the last letter of the madi, like this example here, daraba or akrama or nasara or istansara, the last letter has a fatha, and that fatha is just because that's the way it's built. There's no grammatical significance for the fatha. It's just the way it is. Now he says abadan, always. So daraba, daraba, darabu, darabat, darabata, in 4 of them is fatha. Daraba, daraba, darabat, darabata. But the middle one is darabu, with the ba has a dhamma, because we're not talking about the pronoun, we're talking about the last letter of the verb. So darabu is actually 2 words, the fi'l and the fa'il is the waw, and it seems like the verb, the madi verb, is mabni on dhamma. It's fixed on dhamma, and it's not fixed on fatha like he's saying. Okay, and if you go down, darabat when you're talking about a group of females, ضربت, ضربتما, ضربتم, ضربتي, ضربتما, ضربتمتن. So either to the end of the madi will be attached a wow pronoun or a ضمير رفع متحرك, like ta, tuma, tumti, tuma, tunna, one of those, or ضربت, ضربنا, one of those. So in those cases, the madi verb ends in a sukun. ضرب, ضرب, ضرب. But the author here is claiming that it's maftuh al-akhiri abadan. In other words, in all 14 possibilities of the madi verb, 14 conjugations of the madi verb, the verb ends in a fatha, but that's clearly not true, because in many of them it ends in a sukun, and in one of them it ends in a dhamma. So in the Hidayat al-Nahu book, he just cuts to the chase, and he's saying, he says that, and the madi verb will be mabni on dhamma, illam yattasil bihi wawu jam'in wala damiru raf'in mutaharrikin. So provided that neither of those two things is attached to the end of the madi, then the madi will be mabni on fatha. And وَمَعَ الْوَاوِ عَلَى الضَّمِّ, and along with the waw, the madi verb is mabni on dhamma, and with the ضمير رفع متحرك, the madi verb will be mabni on sukun. So that's how he explains it. Okay, so over here the mu'allif is insisting that is maftuh al-akhir. So why would that be? The commentator will explain this, but I'll just tell you. He's suggesting that darabu is mabni on fatha as well, except the fatha is muqaddara. Okay, and what's preventing the fatha from being there is the last letter, the ba, being occupied by the harakatul munasaba, because waw necessitates dhamma. So it should have had a fatha as well. And if you go down, darabta, darabna, darabta, darabtuma, all of those should have had a fatha as well. But since you don't want the same vowel coming 4 times, like rapid succession, so there's a dislikedness of the same letter being repeated, the same vowel being repeated so many times. In order to break that continuity, a sukun was added. So it's like a pronunciation issue, why those bottom conjugations are ending in sukun, but in reality they're also ending in a fatha. The difference is that in some of them the fatha is zahira, and in some of them the fatha is muqaddara. So he's adding a degree of complexity, if that makes sense. The better way is just to say fatha, dhamma, or sukun. In 4 of them it's with fatha, on fatha, and one of them the madi verb is mabni on dhamma, and in the rest of them the madi verb is mabni on sukun. Okay, look what he says here. Wal amru majzūmun abadan, and the amr will be in the state of jazm always. Now this is problematic, because the amr is mabni, and when something is mabni you don't say it's in jazm, because those things, they don't line up. So I think he's adopting the madhab of the Kufiyin, okay, which is a classical school of thought in grammar, and according to them the amr verb is actually in jazm, and the jazm giving agent would be the assumed or implied lamul amr. So liyaf'al, liyaf'ala, liyaf'alu, litaf'al, litaf'ala, liyaf'alna, li, when it comes at the beginning of the mudari, it creates talab, and so and so must do such and such. He must hit, they must hit, they must hit, she must hit. Hit. The middle ones don't have a must, because the middle ones are direct commands, and the other ones are figurative commands, and they all have the lam of amr. So the Kufiyin, they say that if'al, if'ala, if'alu had a li as well, and that li was removed, and they have some theory behind it, and they have some justification, they have some evidence for that, I would presume. At any rate, the verb is majzūm. Okay, so that's if you adopt that the amr is mu'rab, then you would have to say it's in jazm. But if you say it's mabni, then you say mabni on the sign of jazm. Like what the mudari would be, if the mudari's jazm is reflected with the sukun, then this verb would be mabni on sukun. If the mudari's jazm is reflected with the drop of the noon, then this amr, it would be mabni on the drop of the noon. If'ala. So if'ala is mabni. What is it mabni on? It's mabni on the hadfun noon. If'al is mabni. What is it mabni on? It's mabni on sukun. So we avoid the term jazm, okay, because jazm is reserved for when words are mu'rab, and the amr verb is mabni according to the stronger position amongst the grammarians. Okay, so that's the distinction there. Okay, what is the mudari? He defines it. والمضارع ما كان في أوله إحدى الزوائد الأربعة التي يجمعها قولك أنيت. And the mudari is that in whose beginning there's one of the 4 prefixes, one of the 4 extra letters that are gathered together in your statement, the acronym anaytu. So hamza, nun, ya, and ta. So the ya happens in 4 of them, yafalu, yafalani, yafaluna, and then yafalna. The ta happens in 8 of them, taf'alu, taf'alu, when you're speaking about a female and 2 females, and all the middle second person conjugations begin with ta. تفعلوا تفعلان تفعلون تفعلين تفعلان تفعلنا. Hamza is for number 13, أفعل, and na is we. So I, we, he, they, and then they group of females, and ta is you, 6 U's. Also the she one is تفعل. Okay, وهو مرفوع أبدا, and the mudari verb will always be in rafa. حتى, until upon it enters either a Naṣb giving agent or a Jazm giving agent. And then he mentions what are the Naṣb giving agents, and he says there are 10 of them. Now other grammarians will classify it differently, categorize it differently, and they'd say there's 4, an, lan, kay, in, idan, and those are the 4. And then they say wa anil muqaddara, and the Naṣb giving agents to the mudari verb are 4 and 1 understood one. The 4 are an, lan, kay, in, idan, and the 5th one would be an assumed an. And then you'd mention the places where an is assumed. Okay, so the commentator here will explain this thoroughly, and he'll tell you what they all mean, and he'll give an abundance of examples from the Quran and also from day-to-day sentences that he creates himself. And this commentator does really well with the examples. So we'll wait for that. And the Jawazim, he says, are 18, lam, lamma, and then he mentions a bunch of them. And then we'll discuss this when we get into the commentary. Let's move now into the commentary. 1 second. Okay, here we go. الأفعال ونوعها, verbs and their categories. قال باب الأفعال, the مؤلف says باب الأفعال. الأفعال ثلاثة, verbs are 3 types. ماض ومضارع وأمر, perfect, imperfect, and command. نحو ضرب ويضرب وضرب. We just did this right now. The commentator says وأقول ينقسم الفعل إلى 3 أقسام. The verb divided into 3 types. القسم الأول الماضي. The first type is the ماضي, the perfect verb. Okay, and then he gives a definition. وهو ما يدل على حصول شيء قبل زمن التكلم. نحو ضرب ونصر وفتح وعلم وحسب وكرم. So what is the perfect verb? What is the ماضي? ماضي is the verb that indicates the achievement of an event or the occurrence of an event prior to the time of speech. So in the past tense. Such as ضرب, hit, helped, opened, knew, hasiba, thought or conjectured, karuma, was noble. والقسم الثاني المضارع, and the second type of verb is the imperfect verb, the verb that's either happening now or ongoing, or it hasn't yet started. So present and future. وهو ما دل على حصول شيء, and it is that which indicates the achievement of something either at the time of speech or after the speech is over. في زمن التكلم أو بعده. نحو يضرب وينصر ويفتح ويعلم ويحسب ويكرم. So he brings several examples here to highlight the various middle letter variations within the verb. So there's actually 6 possibilities in the Madi. When you combine the Madi with the Mudari, you get 6 possibilities. We call these the 6 verb forms, the 6 variations of verb form 1. نصر ينصر ضرب يضرب سمع يسمع فتح يفتح كرم يكرم وإن حسب يحسب. At any rate, القسم الثالث الأمر. The third type is the command verb. وهو ما يطلب به حصول شيء, and it is that through which or by means of which the occurrence of an event is sought. The occurrence of an event is desired and sought after the time of speech is over. So you're commanding. So it could be a direct command or it could be an indirect figurative command where you're commanding a third party that's not even there. Like he must hit. So that's also a command verb. But the true command is second person. And it has a particular method of construction where you take the mudari and you remove the ta, and then you look to see what's left after the removal of the ta. If after removing the ta, the first letter of the verb has a sukoon, then you bring the hamza. And depending on the middle letter of the verb, the hamza will either have a dhamma or a kasra. So tansuru becomes unsur, and tadribu becomes idrib, and tasma'u becomes isma'. So if the middle letter of the verb has a dhamma, then the hamza gets a dhamma, otherwise the hamza gets a kasra, and then you treat the last letter of the verb as you would in the state of jazm. So if it's a normal last letter, you put sukoon. If it's a alif or a waw, you drop the alif, you drop the waw. And if it's a conjugation that has a noon, then the noon would omit and drop because this is mabni on the sign of jazm. So that's how mudari verbs are constructed. And if after the removal of the ta, the letter you're dealing with has a vowel, then you don't need the hamza. So taqulu, which means to speak. Taqulu, if you take away the ta from taqulu, you get qulu. So the qaf has a dhamma already. So what you do is you make the last letter sakin, and the waw in between drops and becomes qul. Taqulu becomes qul. Takhafu becomes khaf. Like that. Okay, tataqabbalu becomes taqabbal. Because tataqabbalu has two tas, so you remove one of them and the last letter becomes sakin. So this is all taught. The method of construction for the command verb is created from the mudari, and you go through these steps and you end up with your amr. وَقَدْ ذَكَرْنَا لَكَ فِي أَوَّلِ الْكِتَابِ هَذَا التَّقْسِيمَ. And he says that we've already mentioned to you in the beginning of the book this categorization, this classification. وَذَكَرْنَا لَكَ مَعَهُ. And along with the taqsim, we mentioned for you the indicators of every type from among these three types. So how do you identify an amr? How do you identify a madi verb? How do you identify mudari? So there's ways of doing it. A sin, a sawfa, a ta, a sakin ta, a femininity, etc., etc. So all of this was discussed in the earlier section of the book. أحكام الفعل, the rulings of the verb. The muallif says فالماضي مفتوح الآخر أبدا. The madi will always have a fatha on its last letter. والأمر مجزوم أبدا. And the amr will always be in the state of jazm. Again, he's adopting the Kufi madhab. Okay, I don't think most people would draw attention to this. I think even the commentator, he doesn't speak about that. He doesn't speak about the muallif adopting the Kufi madhab in this regard, and that's why he's expressing it this way. That's why he's calling it majzum, even though he should not have said that. He should have said the amr will always be with sukun. If he said that, but then that's not true. It won't always be with sukun, because depending on what verb it was created from, it might be the omission of the last letter. That's the sign of jazm. So the more precise way to describe this is to say that the amr verb would be mabni on the sign of jazm. Whatever the indicator of jazm would be, the verb would be fixed on that. And the reason we're saying it will be fixed is because there's nothing to induce it. So the amr verb, it doesn't have a particle before it. If'al, so you can't point at the sukun of if'al and say such and such caused it, as you could with liyaf'al. Liyaf'al has a sukun on the last letter, and it's easily traceable to the li, and the li is a governing agent. It's called the lamul amr. The lamul amr caused liyaf'al to receive a sukun. If'al doesn't have any lam, so either you say it's mabni and it has no agent, because mabni means it has a fixed ending and there's nothing to induce any change on it, and for that reason it has a fixed ending. Or you do what the author here is doing. He's adopting the school of thought that amr verbs are in jazm because of an assumed lam of amr. Okay, does that make sense? والمضارع ما كان في أوله إحدى الزوائد الأربعة. The mudari is that in whose beginning there's one of the four extra letters التي يجمعها قولك, which are gathered together in your statement, your acronym أنيت, وهو مرفوع أبدا, and it will always be in rafa حتى يدخل عليه, until to the beginning of it is attached, until to the beginning of it enters either a Naṣb giving agent or a Jazm giving agent, which is normally a harf, but it doesn't have to be a harf, it could be an ism as well. In the case of the Jazm, it could be an ism. وأقول بعد أن بين المصنف أنواع الأفعال شرع في بيان أحكام كل نوع منها. He says that after the author explained that the categories of verbs, he now begins in talking about the ahkam of every category. What are the rulings of every category? How do you treat it? فَحُكْمُ الْفِعْلِ الْمَاضِ. So the ruling of the perfect verb is for it to be fixed on fatha. الْبِنَاءُ عَلَى الْفَتْحِ. وَهَذَا الْفَتْحُ. And this fatha إِمَّا ظَاهِرٌ وَإِمَّا مُقَدَّرٌ, is either visible or is understood and assumed. أَمَّا الْفَتْحُ الظَّاهِرُ. As for the visible fatha, فَفِي الصَّحِيحِ الْآخِرِ. So that will occur within madi verbs that have a normal last letter, like nasara, daraba, sami'a. الَّذِي لَمْ يَتَّصِلْ بِهِ, with the added condition that to it is not attached the waw of the group of men, and neither any marfu, rafa based mutaharrik pronoun, as opposed to a sakin pronoun, like fa'ala has a alif, but that alif is a sakin pronoun, and fa'alat it doesn't have a pronoun at all because it has the ta femininity, which is not a pronoun. Fa'alata has attached to it an alif, but it's not mutaharrik pronoun. So it can have a pronoun, but it can't have a mutaharrik rafa based pronoun. So if it's free of the waw of group of men and free of the rafa based mutaharrik pronoun, then it will be the fatha will be visible if it's a normal last letter. Now if it's an alif, then you're not going to see the fatha. Okay, وكذلك في كل ما كان آخره واوا أو ياء. And similarly, in other words, the fatha will be visible. Similarly, the fatha will be visible in all such verbs whose last letter is a waw or a ya. Now, how can a madi verb end in a waw? Wouldn't the waw just change to an alif automatically, like the a? If it's from karuma, it can happen. Sarua. Over here, sarua. Sarua means to be, I guess it means to be a leader, or like a leader of a tribe. Wa badua. Badua, I think it means ill-mannered or something. Like a person he doesn't have good manners. Wa badua. So the waw, the fatha is there. Radiya, shaqiya, very common verbs. Radiya and shaqiya, they're ending in a ya, and yet the fatha, because fatha is a light vowel that's easy to pronounce. So pronouncing it on a waw is not particularly difficult. Pronouncing it on a ya is not particularly difficult. So it's tolerated. Now, the fatha will be understood if it's an alif, and he's going to talk about that. Okay, so these are the places where the fatha is explicit. It's visible. It's apparent and visible when there's no pronoun attached to it, and the last letter is a normal last letter, or it's a waw or a ya. وأما الفتح المقدر فهو على ثلاثة أنواع. And as for the understood fatha, okay, every madi is mabni on fatha, but the fatha is sometimes not visible, sometimes it's understood. So he's saying the understood one can happen in three ways. Okay, so what he's going to say here, before I read it, what he's going to say is that the reason why the fatha is not being pronounced is because the alif can't support it. So in other words, we're going to call that ta'azzur. Or it's going to be because of the harakatul munasaba, which happens in darabu. That the ba should have had a fatha because madis are mabni on fatha, but the waw necessitated dhamma, and that then engaged the vowel to be it left no room. It left no room. It's preoccupied. There's no room for it, and that's called thiqal. No, that's called munasaba, harakatul munasaba. Or it could be because of awkwardness, and awkwardness happens in those bottom conjugations where the pronoun is also mutaharrik. So if every letter of the verb is mutaharrik and the pronoun also mutaharrik, then this creates a succession of vowels in what appears to be a single word. Okay, and that's heavy and that's awkward, and the Arab people, they like to avoid that, so they force the sukun there. And so if they ask you, darabta, what is it mabni on? You say it's mabni on a fatha muqaddara, and what's prevented that fatha from being expressed and pronounced is the dislikedness of a similar vowel coming repeatedly. And he's going to say something along those lines. So look what he said. لأنه إما يكون مقدرا للتعذر, because the fatha will either be assumed because of impossibility, like it's problematic, you really can't do it. وهذا في كل ما كان آخره ألفا, and that would be in every verb whose last letter is actually an alif, such as da'a and sa'a. فكل منهما فعل ماض. So each one of these is the madi verb. مبني على فتح مقدر, مبني on an understood fatha, على الألف, which is on the alif. منع من ظهوره التعذر. What prevented that fatha from becoming visible is the impossibility and the problematic nature of it. وإما يكون الفتح مقدرا للمناسبة, or the fatha will be understood and assumed because of the waw pronoun necessitating a particular vowel that prevented any other vowel from appearing. وذلك في كل فعل ماض, and that would be in every madi verb اتصل به واو جماعة, to the end of which is attached the waw of the group of men. نحو كتبوا وسعدوا فكل منهما فعل ماض. So each one of these is a madi verb. مبني على فتح مقدر, mabni on an understood fatha, assumed fatha. Where is it assumed? It's assumed on its last letter. What prevented it? منع من ظهوره اشتغال المحل. What prevented that fatha from being visible and pronounced is the location being preoccupied with the harakatul munasaba, with the haraka necessitated by the waw, which in this case is a dhamma. وواو الجماعة مع كل منهما فاعل. And the واو الجماعة in both of those examples, كتبوا and سعدوا, is a fa'il, and it's mabni on sukun, and it's in the place of rafa because it's representing something that's supposed to be in rafa, in other words fa'il. وإما أن يكون الفتح مقدرا, or the fatah will be muqaddar لدفع كراهة توالي أربع متحركات, in order to thwart the repulsiveness of 4 voweled letters coming in rapid succession. كراهة توالي أربع متحركات. So in order to avoid that, the continuity was broken by giving a sukun. And that's what I mentioned earlier. وذلك في كل فعل ماض, and this is in every ماضي verb, اتصل به ضمير رفع متحرك, to the end of which is attached a rafa-based متحرك pronoun. كتاء الفاعل, like the ta of the fa'il, ضربت, ضربتي, ضربت, that ta. ونون النسوة, or ضربنا, that noon, which signifies group of females, such as كتبت وكتبت وكتبتي وكتبنا وكتبنا. فكل واحد من هذه الأفعال, so every one of these verbs, فعل ماض is a ماضي verb, مبني على فتح مقدر, which is mabni on a fatha, which is assumed to be on the last letter. منع من ظهوره, what prevented that fatha from being visible, اشتغال المحلي, is the letter being preoccupied بالسكون, by the sukun, which temporarily occurred in order to serve the following purpose. لدفع كراهة توالي أربع متحركات, in order to remove the repulsiveness of the successive coming of 4 voweled consonants. So if you have 4 voweled consonants in rapid succession, then this is no good. فيما هو كالكلمة الواحدة, in what appears to be a single word. So if it happens in 2 separate words, that's fine, but over here they're written together, and they are 2 separate words, but they're written together with no space in between, so you don't want 4 vowels in rapid succession. So in order to break that, the fatha was done away with and replaced with the sukun. والتاء أو ناء أو النون فاعل, so the ta in كتبت, كتبتي, كتبت, كتبت, كتبتي, the na in كتبنا, and the noon in كتبنا, all of those are fa'il, and they're all mabni on dhamma or fatha or kasa or sukun. They're fixed on whatever they are on, that it's because that's the way they're built, and they're all in the place of rafa. وحكم فعل الأمر البناء على ما يجزم به مضارعه. And the ruling of the command verb is for it to be mabni on whatever indicator the mudari is, on whatever the mudari's jazm is reflected through. On whatever the mudari's jazm is reflected through. So it could be a sukun, it could be the omission of the last letter, it could be the omission of the noon. فإن كان مضارعه صحيح الآخر, so if the mudari is such that its last letter is normal, ويجزم بالسكون, and it happens to receive jazm through sukun, كان الأمر مبنيا على السكون. In that case, the amr would be fixed on that sukun. وهذا السكون, and this sukun will either be ظاهر or it will be مقدر. Okay, now he's introducing degrees of complexity here, and this is unnecessary. Okay, but he's doing it. So what is he saying? That this sukun will either be visible or it will be understood. فالسكون الظاهر له موضعان. So in some of them, the sukun, in 2 places, the sukun will be ظاهر, and that will be if'al and if'alna. If'al, when it's singular conjugation, nothing attached to it, no pronouns attached to it. And if'alna is when the noon of niswa is attached, when you're speaking to a group of females. فالسكون الظاهر له موضعان أحدهما أن يكون صحيح آخر ولم يتصل به شيء. The first occasion where the sukun is lovely or the sukun is visible is when the amr verb has a normal last letter and there's nothing attached to it. والثاني أن تتصل به نون النسوة, and the second occasion where sukun is visible is for the verb to have a noon, a feminine plurality attached to it, such as idrib waktub, and those are singular examples. وكذلك idribna waktubna مع الإسناد إلى نون النسوة, while predication is occurring to the noon of the group of females. So in other words, the command is being directed to a group of females. وأما السكون المقدر فله موضع واحد, and as for the assumed sukun, then this occurs in one place, and وهو أن تتصل به نون التوكيد, and that is if Okay, to the end of it, the noon of emphasis is attached. Then these verbs should have also been in sukun. These verbs should have also ended in sukun. If'alanna, if'alanna, if'alan, if'alunna, if'alanna, if'alan, idriban, waktuban, idribanna, waktubanna. That's the example he gives here. So over here, the ba should have had a sukun. Okay, so what he's saying here is fine. The ba should have had a sukun. And the reason it has a fatha is because the noon has a sukun. So you can't say, you can't do it. Like you can't pronounce two sukuns. So a vowel needed to be given there in order to remove the iltiqa sakinain, and that fatha there is not, that fatha there is preventing the sukun from being there, obviously. وإن كان مضارعه معتل الآخر, and if its mudari is ending in a weak last letter, فهو يجزم, then its jazm will be reflected by the omission of the weak letter. So we already know that from the mudari. He said فالأمر منه يبنى. So any amr constructed from such a verb will be mabni on the omission of the letter of weakness, such as ud'u, iqdi, and is'a. وإن كان مضارعه من الأفعال الخمسة, and if its mudari is from the 5 verbs, in other words a dual conjugation or a plural masculine one, or when you're speaking to a female, if Ali, then in all cases, فهو يجزم بحذف النون. The amr, no, the mudari would be, the mudari's jazm would be reflected with the omission of the noon. So therefore, the amr from it will be mabni on the omission of the noon, such as uktuba, waktubu, waktubi, and that concludes the discussion. والفعل المضارع علامته أن يكون في أوله حرف زائد من 4 أحرف يجمعها قولك, and then he gives the acronym. The mudari verb, its sign is, the definition of the mudari came earlier in the book, so he's not defining it, and the commentator already defined it for us like a couple of pages ago. So he's saying that the mudari verb, its sign, in other words, how do we know that we're dealing with the mudari verb from among the other verbs, is that in its beginning will be an extra letter from a group of 4 letters that are gathered together in your statement anaitu, or in your statement na'aitu, or in your statement atayna, or if you want you can say na'ti. So any one of these acronyms will work. Anaitu, okay, what do they mean? Okay, whatever they mean. Na'aitu means I became distant. Atayna means they, group of females, arrived and came. Na'ti means we will come. Okay, the point is not the meaning of the acronym, obviously, right? فَالْهَمْزَةُ لِلْمُتَكَلِّمِ مُذَكَّرًا أَوْ مُؤَنَّثًا. So the hamza occurs in the first person singular, whether it be a male or whether it be a female, such as أفهم, I understand. وَالنُّونُ لِلْمُتَكَلِّمِ الَّذِي يُعَظِّمُ نَفْسَهُ. And the noon is for the speaker who is magnifying their own self, or it's for the speaker that has with him someone else. In other words, we. So the royal we, or it's literal, like more than one person doing the verb, and you're not speaking just about yourself, but you're speaking about others that are sharing in that action. نحو نفهم, we understand. والياء للغائب, and the ya is for the third person, such as يقوم. والتاء للمخاطب, and the ta is for the mukhatab, when you're speaking for the second person, and also for the third person feminine. The ta is used for the third person feminine as well. In other words, she. نحو أنت تفهم يا محمد واجبك, that you, O Muhammad, clearly understand your responsibility. ونحو تفهم زينب واجبها. Zainab understands her responsibility. So this is third person. Zainab is the fa'il, and over here you. أنت تفهم يا محمد واجبك. فإن لم تكن هذه الحروف زائدة. So if these particles are not extraneous, but rather they're part of the actual verb, the first letter of the verb, like akala. Akala, the hamza is not the sign of I. It's not a prefix. It's actually the first letter of the verb. وَنَقَلَ. Naqala means to transmit. وَتَفَلَ, which means to spit. وَيَنَعَ. يَنَعَ, it means to be ripe, like as in a fruit. أو كان الحرف زائدا, or the ta that might be there at the beginning of the verb is extraneous, but it's not there in order to signify imperfection. It's not there in order to signify that the verb is imperfect, present, future. It's got nothing to do with that. It's part of the verb form. Like the istansara, yastansiru, istansara has the sin in the ta. So there's particular enhanced verb paradigms that have a ta as part of their pattern, like taqabbala and taqabala. So that's what he's talking about here. So, right? So there is أو كان الحرف زائدا, or there is an extra harf at the front, or the hamza in akrama. Akrama has a hamza as well. لكنه ليس للدلالة على المعنى الذي ذكرناه. However, it is not there in order to signify the meaning we're talking about here. نحو أكرم وتقدم, like أكرم has a hamza and تقدم has a ta, and they're of no use to us. كان الفعل ماضيا, then in that case the verb will be a madi and it wouldn't be a mudari. So if this تقدم needed to be a mudari, you'd say يتقدم, and it could become تتقدم with two tas. So that's like a madi number one. تقدم is a madi number one, and these things are taught in the science of sarf. Okay, let's keep going. وحكم الفعل المضارع أنه معرب, and the ruling of the mudari verb is that it is mu'rab. It does fluctuate grammatically, it reflects and it changes. ما لم تتصل به نون التوكيد, provided that to the end of it, as long as to the end of it the noon of emphasis is not attached. ثقيلة كانت أو خفيفة, in its heavy version or in its light version. أو نون النسوة, and similarly the noon of feminine plurality is also not attached, because if any of these things attached, then the verb becomes مبني. فإن اتصلت به نون التوكيد بني معها على الفتح. So if to the end of it the noon of emphasis is attached, then it will become mabni on fatha. So why doesn't, okay, mabni on fatha, that's fine. It will become mabni on fatha and not the sign of jazm. You know that sign of jazm business that he talked about in the if'alanna? He said over there is sukun, and the sukun is muqaddara. Okay, I think this is fine. We don't have to read too much into it. It's okay. If you have any questions about this, go ahead, post in the comments and we can investigate this further. I think it's fine. نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يسجنن, he will absolutely be imprisoned. ولا يكون من الصاغرين, and he will definitely be of those that are humiliated. وإن اتصلت به نون النسوة, and if to the end of it is attached the noon of women, بني معها على السكون, along with that noon the verb will now be mabni on sukun, such as the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَ أَوْلَادَهُنَّ, that mothers shall breastfeed their children. أَوْلَادَهُنَّ. وَإِذَا كَانَ مُعْرَبًا, and if the mudari verb is mu'rab, in other words these conditions are met, so there's no noon of emphasis, there's no noon of feminine plurality, فَهُوَ مَرْفُوعٌ, then in that case the mudari verb would be in rafa, مَا لَمْ يَدْخُلْ عَلَيْهِ نَاصِبٌ أَوْ جَازِمٌ, as long as to the end of it, to the beginning of it, in the beginning of it, no nasab giver and no jazm giver enters. نحو يفهم محمد فيفهم, so يفهم is a mudari verb which is in rafa, لتجرده من الناصب والجازم, due to its being empty and stripped from the nasab giving and jazm giving agents. وعلامة رفعه, and the indicator of its rafa is the explicit visible dhamma, الضمة الظاهرة. ومحمد فاعل مرفوع بالضمة الظاهرة, and محمد is a fa'il which is also in rafa with a different reason. It's over here the reason for the rafa is because it's being used as a fa'il by way of the visible explicit dhamma. فإن دخل عليه ناصب نصبه, and if a nasab giving agent enters upon the mudari, it will induce nasab. It will cause the verb to go into the state of nasab, such as لن يخيب مجتهد, a hardworking person will never fail. فلن, so lan is a harfu nafyin wa nasbin wa istiqbal. It's a particle of negation and nasab induction. Induces, induction is probably not the right word. It's a particle of negation and nasab inducing, and it's a particle of future tense. So it restricts the verb to the future and the present tense goes away. وَيَخِيبَ فِعْلٌ مُضَارِعٌ مَنْصُوبٌ بِلَنْ. So here we have a mudari verb which is mansub because of the lan. وعلامة نصبه, and the indicator of its nasab is the visible fatha, الفتحة الظاهرة. ومجتهد, and the noun mujtahidun is a fa'il which is in rafa, and the indicator of its rafa is the explicit dhamma. وإن دخل عليه جازم جزمه, and if a jazm giving agent enters before it, it will cause jazm, such as لم يجزع إبراهيم, Ibrahim did not panic. فلم حرف نفي وجزم مخل, it's a particle that number one negates, number two causes jazm, and number three flips the verb from its present future tenses and takes it back into the madi. Flips. ويجزع فعل مضارع مجزوم بلم, And يجزع is a mudari verb that's in jazm because of lam. وعلامة جزمه السكون, and the indicator of his jazm is sukun. وإبراهيم فاعل مرفوع وعلامة رفعه الضمة الظاهرة, and I think that's pretty clear. Okay, now we have some questions which we'll skip for the sake of time. And then for the Naṣb al-Mudari and the Jawazim al-Mudari, we'll create 2 separate lessons. And I think we'll end this here. Okay, وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so now we're ready to move into the particles that come before a mudari verb and cause the verb to go into the state of nasab. He says here there's 10 of them. The mu'allif, he says قال فالنواصب عشرة, the nasab giving agents are 10. وهي أن ولن وإذن وكي ولام كي ولام الجحود وحتى والجواب بالفاء والواو وأو. Okay, so the details of all 10 of these are forthcoming. The commentary is going to excruciating detail and talk about them one by one. Basically, whenever you have a harf and you want to really appreciate what the harf is, then you should know how it governs. Okay, so being able to distinguish about any given particle, whether it governs or doesn't govern, is important. Some particles, they don't induce any change on the nouns or the verbs that they come before, but they do contribute to the meaning. Obviously, they'll contribute to the meaning, and then the feature and function is important. So how does it contribute to the meaning? Does it create, does it suggest persuasion? Is it in order to convert the sentence and turn it into a question? What is the particle doing? So what the commentator does here, for every one of them, he'll give us 2 or 3 ingredients. So he'll say this is a harf of X, Y, and Z. This is a harf of Naṣb. Okay, like for example with the an, he says this is a harf of Naṣb, of masdar Naṣb and istiqbal. So on the one hand, it takes the verb and puts it into the meaning of the masdar. So it becomes like to prostrate. They are prostrating becomes to prostrate, and then it induces changes at the end of the verb, that if it was a singular conjugation, the verb now has a fatha to represent the nasab, or if it's a dual or a plural, then the verb loses its noon. So that's part of the feature and function of the an. An did that. And the third thing it did is it put the verb in the meaning of the future. So there's a future element there. Okay, but the future element is secondary, and the masdar meaning is the primary meaning. Okay, and there's more to it, and we'll talk about it inshallah when we get there. So he does that for all 10 of them. I can give you their basic translations to get you going, and then we can get into the commentary. So an, it means to prostrate, to eat, to help, to hit. So like I want to read. أريد أحب أن أقرأ. I love reading books. أحب أن أقرأ. So that's what an does. ولن, and lan takes the verb, negates it, and forces it into the future tense, and the translation becomes I will never do such and such. إذن is used to respond. So if somebody makes a comment and you want to encourage them and say that if that's the case, then absolutely you'd be successful. Okay, like if what you told me is true, then Allah will not render us helpless, or Allah will not waste us. It comes in the stories of the Prophet's book. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam is speaking to his wife and explaining to her how he's been commanded to travel. So she goes, then who will take care of us? And then he explains everything, and then she says, إِذَنْ لَا يُدِيعَنَا. In that case, he will not waste us. In other words, Allah will take care of us. Kay is in order to introduce the verb being an effect of a cause. So this action was done in order that something else could happen. So that something else would be the mudari verb, and kay is in order to introduce reason and cause. Not that the particle is entered on the reason, but the particle is showing that the earlier verb is the reason for the upcoming verb. Okay, and that will make more sense when the examples come. Lam okay, the lam preposition for ta'lil, and it's used, and some scholars refer to it as the lam ta'lil. The mu'allif here is calling it lam okay. And then we have another lam that's used in order to reinforce negation, particularly in sentences that start with ma kana or lam yakun. ما كان الله ليعذبهم. Allah was not one to punish them. Allah was never going to punish them. حتى is used to show that a certain action is culminating in its ending, or it's also used to introduce reason and cause, and the commentator will talk about all of these things and give abundant examples. And then we have وَالْجَوَابُ بِالْفَاءِ وَالْوَاوِ وَأَوْ, that when you issue a command and you build on that command a mudari verb, like do such and such in order that something else can happen. Okay, so again, examples are forthcoming, and I can even so it would be like in a question environment, like you pose a question, a rhetorical question, and you say that will Iblis not misguide the people so that they too can enter the hellfire with him? Of course he will. In other words, wouldn't you expect these two things to occur together? That number one, Iblis misguiding the people, and number two, the people entering the hellfire and becoming guilty as well. So he's already guilty, so he would want the children of Adam to also be guilty. Okay, so that's like a sentence I remember from the Stories of the Prophets book. So this is worth knowing, and the commentator is going to go into sufficient detail and talk about every one of these individually. So he starts off, he says وأقول الأدوات التي ينسب بعدها الفعل المضارع عشرة أحرف. The agents after which the mudari verb is in the state of nasab are 10 particles. وهي على ثلاثة أقسام, and these particles are divided into three types. قسم ينسب بنفسه, there's a type that directly gives nasab to the mudari verb. And then there's another type that gives nasab to the mudari verb through an an, which is assumed after it permissibly. In other words, you can assume the an or you can combine it with the an and say both. Okay, so like the lam of kay, ليأتي لأن يأتي. So أرسلوا إليها رجلا, they sent to the well a man, ليأتي لهم بالماء, in order that he bring back for them water. لأن يأتي لهم بالماء. So you can say لأن يأتي, or you could just say ليأتي and not have the an. In which case, in both cases, it's the an that's doing it. It's the an that's giving the nasab to the mudari verb. So it's like one of the places in the language where an would be assumed is after the lam of kay. Okay, so the nasab is, and there's a type that give nasab to the mudari verb through the an, which is assumed after it permissibly, and then there's a third type that gives nasab to the mudari verb through an which is definitely assumed after it. In other words, to mention the an would be a mistake and it would be an error, and that's like hatta. So after hatta. Okay, so examples are forthcoming. I don't think I have to make up examples. Let's get into the commentary. Let's look what he's saying. So right now you have this division. Okay, and this is a pretty remarkable the way he's doing it, because in certain books they list the nasab givers to the mudari as 5. There's only 5 particles that give nasab to the mudari, and they are an, lan, kay, idhan, wa anil muqaddaratu, and the assumed an. Okay, and then so in certain cases the an is assumed jawazan, and in other cases the an is assumed wujuban. Regardless, وَتُقَدَّرُ أَنْ فِي سَبْعَةِ مَوَاضِعٍ, and an is assumed in 7 places: after the lam of kay, after the lam of juhud, after hatta, after a particular fa that comes in response to one of several items like amr, nahi, and istifham, and taraji, and tamanni, and so there's a longing and wishing, or there's a persuasion, or there's a command, and what you're doing with the command is that you're building on the command a second verb. In other words, it's like study hard for your exam so that you're successful. So the second verb, the so that you're successful verb, would be in nasab, and there would be a fa there. So ijtahid fi durusika fatanjaha, like that, fatanjaha. And so there will be like between the fa and the tanjaha there will be an assumed. Okay, so the commentator will talk about all of these things in great detail, inshallah. So he says, أما القسم الأول, as for the first category of particles that give nasab, وهو الذي ينصب الفعل المضارع بنفسه, and these are the primary ones, the ones that give nasab to the mudari verb directly, فأربعة أحرف. So that's 4 particles, and they are an, lan, idhan, and kay. Okay, so now he's going to talk about the feature and function of each one. So look what he says. He says, Amma an. As for an, primarily it's a particle of masdar and naṣb. So naṣb is what it does to the verb. Okay, so for all of them, as part of their definition, the word naṣb, you'll expect it to appear in all of them because they're all part of this group. So that's their commonality. Their commonality is they all give naṣb, and then they differ among each other. So an, specifically what it does, in addition to rendering the mudari verb in the state of naṣb, in addition what it does is it takes the verb and puts it into the meaning of masdar and leaves an element of future. So the future doesn't disappear altogether, it's there, like in the background. And then the example makes it even clearer. وَمِثَالُهَا, and the example of that is the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَطْمَعُ أَن يَغْفِرَ لِي, I am hopeful that my Lord will forgive me. I am hopeful of the forgiveness. I covet the forgiveness of my Lord. The forgiveness of my Lord. وَقَوْلُهُ جَلَّ ذِكْرُهُ, and the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَخَافُ أَن يَأْكُلَهُ الذِّئْبُ, I am fearful that the wolf will eat him. I fear the wolf eating him. A pure master translation would be, I fear the wolf eating him. And if you want to maintain the istiqbal, you can say, I am fearful that the wolf will eat him. Either one of those two translations is acceptable, and they're both acceptable. وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنِّي لَيَحْزُنُنِي, indeed it grieves me, أَن تَذْهَبُوا بِهِ, for you to take him away. So your taking him away is what grieves me. So if you look at all three examples, and then he gives the fourth example as well, let's do that too. وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَجْمَعُوا أَن يَجْعَلُوهُ فِي غَيَابَةِ الْجُبِّ, and they, the brothers, firmly resolved themselves and decided to put him in the depths of the well. فِي غَيَابَةِ الْجُبِّ. So in all three of these examples, what we have is we have mudari verbs that are ultimately becoming maf'ul bihi. So yaghfir li, all of that structure together is becoming the object of the hoping. And over here, the wolf eating him is the maf'ul bihi for fearing. And over here, the brothers taking Yusuf ﷺ away is the thing that's grieving him. It's the fa'il for the verb yahzunu. So yahzunu requires a fa'il, and an tadhabu bihi is the fa'il. And ajma'u an yaj'aluhu fi ghayabat al-jubbi is an example of a verbal sentence that's being reduced down into the meaning of the masdar in order that it could be the object and the maf'ul bihi for ajma'u. So the principle here is that an ism could be used in 22 different ways. Okay, we already know that, right? An ism could be used in 22 different ways. Every one of those 22 could be occupied by a phrase. So a phrasal structure where you have two or more words connecting together in a phrase level relationship can become the fa'il. So it doesn't have to be one word that's becoming the fa'il. It could be a mawsuf sifa together becoming a fa'il. Or it could be a ma'tuf alayh and a ma'tuf, or a badal, or mudaf and mudaf ilayh together becoming a fa'il. And this is common, and this is well known, and this is understood. Okay, now when you survey the 22 places, there are a few of them that a sentence can also occupy, like a predicate. Like you can have a predicate occurring as a sentence. So instead of Zaydun alimun, you say Zaydun abuhu alimun. Zayd is knowledgeable. Zayd, his father is knowledgeable. His father is knowledgeable. So his father is knowledgeable is a full sentence that's occurring as the predicate for the Zayd at the front. You see? So khabar is one of the places in the language where a full sentence can occupy and it can become a predicate. Now there's some that only single nouns or phrases can occupy, and a sentence is too large and a sentence doesn't fit. Fa'il and maf'ul bihi are those. So in all of these examples, it's either a fa'il or maf'ul bihi. The sentence is too large, so what an does is it reduces it to the meaning of the masdar and it puts it in the power of a mufrad. So now it's in the power of a mufrad and now it fits the slot. So we say an yaghfir li, all of that together is in the place of naṣb because it's maf'ul bihi. That's how it would be explained. Okay, hopefully that made sense. وَأَمَّا لَن, and as for lan, فَحَرْفُ نَفْيٍ وَنَصْبٍ وَاسْتِقْبَالٍ. So this is a particle that number one negates, and number two renders the upcoming verb in the state of naṣb, and number three restricts the verb to the future. وَمِثَالُهُ قَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the example of it is the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَن نُؤْمِنَ لَكَ, we will never believe you. وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَن نَبْرَحَ عَلَيْهِ عَاكِفِينَ, we will absolutely remain committed as we are to the worship of the calf. In other words, we will not cease. We will never cease doing this. We'll just keep doing this until Musa comes back and he tells us otherwise. وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ, you people will never attain righteousness. وَأَمَّا إِذَنْ, moving on to the third one, إِذَنْ, he says, فَحَرْفُ جَوَابٍ وَجَزَاءٍ وَنَصْبٍ. So this is a particle that's used to respond to someone's comment and to build on what they said. Build on what they said as a consequence. So jaza means consequence. So they said something, so you're concurring and you're saying that if what you're saying is true, then in that case. So إذن means then in that case. Then in that case. وَيُشْتَرَطُ لِنَصْبِ الْمُضَارِعِ بِهَا ثَلَاثَةُ شُرُوطٍ. And in order for the mudari verb to be in the state of nasb because of إذن, there's three conditions that need to be met. الأول أن تكون إذن في صدر جملة الجواب. Number one is that the إذن particle needs to be at the beginning of the sentence that's introducing the response. It has to be at the very beginning. There can't be anything before it. It has to be at the front. الثاني أن يكون المضارع الواقع بعدها دالا على الاستقبال. The second condition is the mudari verb that's occurring after إذن needs to indicate future. Like clear. Like the person can say, if that's the case, then yesterday you passed the exam. That doesn't make any sense. So it has to be speaking about a hypothetical thing in the future and not an event that's already occurred. Okay? الثالث ألا يفصل بينها وبين المضارع فاصل. And the third condition is that between the إذن and between the mudari verb, no separation can occur. Nothing can be a separator between it and between the mudari verb other than qasam and other than nida. So you say إذن يا محمد تنجح. If that's the case, then, oh Muhammad, you'll be successful. Okay, that would work because it's a nida that's coming in between. Or إذن والله تنجح. In that case, I swear by Allah, you will succeed. So those two are acceptable. Any other separation would not work. Or it could be negation, like Allah. In that case, he will not waste us. إذن لا يضيعنا. So la is coming as a separator between the إذن and the mudari. Acceptable. Anything else would not be acceptable. He says, وَمِثَالُ الْمُسْتَوْفِيَةِ لِلشُّرُوطِ. And the example of the إذا that satisfies all of these conditions is for someone to say to you, for one of your brothers to say to you, أَن يَقُولَ لَكَ أَحَدُ إِخْوَانِكَ سَأَجْتَهِدُ فِي دُرُوسِي. I am soon going to make a lot of effort in my lessons. So in response to that, you say, إِذَن تَنْجَحَ. If that's true, then you will succeed. So over here, there's no separation. وَمِثَالُ الْمَفْصُولَةِ بِالْقَسَمِ. And the example of that, in which a separation has occurred through an oath, is for you to respond and say إِذَن وَاللَّهِ تَنْجَحَ. So you insert a wallahi in between, it's still acceptable. The mudari verb would still be in the state of nasab. وَمِثَالُ الْمَفْصُولَةِ بِالنِّدَاءِ أَن تَقُولَ. And the example of that, which has been separated from the mudari verb by way of an evoking structure, is for you to respond and say إِذَن يَا مُحَمَّدُ تَنْجَحَ. That, oh Muhammad, in that case, you will be successful. وَمِثَالُ الْمَفْصُولَةِ بِلَا النَّافِيَةِ أَن تَقُولَ إِذَن لَا يَخِيبَ سَعْيُكَ. So instead of saying you'll be successful, you respond and say, in that case, your efforts will not go to waste. إِذَن لَا يَخِيبَ سَعْيُكَ. Or you say, in that case, I swear by Allah, your work will not go to waste. لَا يَذْهَبَ عَمَلُكَ ضَيَاعًا. Okay, it's a similar meaning. وَأَمَّا كَيْ. And as for كَيْ فَحَرْفُ مَصْدَرٍ وَنَصْبٍ. So this كَيْ, it does the same thing. It renders the verb into the meaning of the masdar, and it puts the verb in the state of nasab, and it introduces cause-effect relationship, which he doesn't mention here, but it does happen, as you'll see from the examples. وَيُشْتَرَطُ فِي النَّصْبِ بِهَا أَن تَتَقَدَّمَهَا لَامُ التَّعْلِيلِ لَفْظًا أو تتقدمها هذه اللام تقديرا. Oh, okay. So the commentator here, he is adopting a particular position among the grammarians that it's not the kay that introduces the reason and cause. There's a lam that's doing it. And the lam is sometimes mentioned alongside it, so the two are mentioned together. لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا. It comes in the Quran. لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا. That all of these calamities and tribulations and masa'ib, they occur within the world, and part of the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings tribulations is لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا, in order that you not grieve excessively on some benefit that you might have lost, so that, in other words, so that you can train yourselves to be composed. So when a tragedy hits you, then you're able to say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, and you don't let that depress you. Okay, and similarly, when you receive a blessing, so that you can understand that these blessings are from Allah, and we have no right to be exuberant and overly joyous and forget Allah and stop worshipping, for example. So لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا. So if there's a li and a kay combined together, then the ta'lil is coming from the li. It's not coming from the kay. The reason and cause is not coming from the kay. It's coming from the li. And the kay is taking the verbal sentence and reducing it into the meaning of the masdar, because prepositions do not enter on verbs. Prepositions enter on isms, and a masdar is an ism. So that's the logic behind it. ويشترط في النصب بها أن تتقدمها لام التعليل لفظا. And the condition for Naṣb to occur by way of kay is for the kay to be preceded by the lam al-ta'lil, either visibly at the spoken level, such as the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala لِكَيْ لَا تَأْسَوْا, or that the lam, that this particular lam precede the kay in an inferred way. So either there physically, or we understand it to be there even if it's not there physically. Such as the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً, in order that the wealth not become concentrated in the hands of few. فَإِذَا لَمْ تَتَقَدَّمْهَا اللَّامُ لَفْظًا وَلَا تَقْدِيرًا كَانَ النَّصْبُ بِأَنْ مُضْمَرَةً. And if there doesn't appear to be any lam prior to it, neither at the spoken level, nor for whatever reason, assuming a lam prior to it is also invalid. Maybe there's no verb in the vicinity, to which, because there has to be a verb somewhere that the prepositional phrase would become muta'alliq to. And if there's no verb earlier, then you're going to say that after the kay there's an an. And the kay would be for ta'lil. I guess that's what the kay itself would be the harf of ta'lil. Okay, so he's giving the impression that this is the rare case. And for there to be a lam, either lafdhan or taqdeeran, is 99% of the time. فَإِذَا لَمْ تَتَقَدَّمْهَا اللَّامُ لَفْظًا وَلَا تَقْدِيرًا. And if no lam is preceding kay, neither in the words nor is it valid to assume it, then كان النصب بأن مضمرة. Then in that case the nasb would be through an an, which is assumed, and in that case وكانت كي نفسها حرف تعليل. Kay itself would be the particle that's introducing the reason and cause. وأما القسم الثاني, and as for the second category of nawasib, وهو الذي ينصب الفعل المضارع بواسطة أن مضمرة بعده جوازا. And that would be the particles that give nasab to the mudari verb through the medium of an an that's assumed after it at a permissible level. So that's a single harf. There's only one harf like that. فحرف واحد, and that would be the lam of ta'lil. وعبر عنها المؤلف بلام كي, and the author has referred to it as the lam of kay. لاشتراكهما, because of both the lam of ta'lil, which is a preposition, and the kay, which conceivably could be in the meaning of the lam, like you just mentioned at the end here, because of both of them sharing an indication on reason and cause. وَمِثَالُهَا, and the example of that would be the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he gives a couple of examples. لِيَغْفِرَ لَكَ اللَّهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِن ذَنْبِكَ وَمَا تَأَخَّرَ. In order that Allah forgive for you all of your previous and upcoming sins. مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِن ذَنْبِكَ وَمَا تَأَخَّرَ. وقوله جل شأنه, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ليعذب الله المنافقين والمنافقات, in order that Allah punish the hypocrite man and the hypocrite women. وأما القسم الثالث, and as for the third category of nawasib, وهو الذي ينصب الفعل المضارع, and it is those that give nasab to the mudari verb through the medium of the an, assumed at an obligatory level. So it's assumed, definitely assumed. Mentioning it physically or mentioning it verbally is considered an error and a mistake. فَخَمْسَةُ أَحْرُفٍ. So there's 5 particles like that. Okay? And they are الأول لام الجحود, the lam of rejection. وضابطها أن تسبق بما كان أو لم يكن. And its rule is for it to be preceded by either ما كان or لم يكن. فمثال الأول, so the example of being preceded by ما كان is the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ما كان الله ليذر المؤمنين على ما أنتم عليه. Allah was never going to abandon and leave the believers on the circumstance that you're currently on. In other words, the hypocrites and the believers need to be made distinct. So these trials and tribulations are brought into this world in order to test the people in their sincerity, so that it becomes known to all who is a threat and who is a genuine friend and who is like there just to cause discontent and to cause confusion and to rile people up, and especially in times of war. ما كان الله ليذر المؤمنين على ما أنتم عليه. وقوله سبحانه وتعالى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وما كان الله ليعذبهم, Allah was never one to punish them. ومثال الثاني, and the example of the second, in other words being preceded by لم يكن, is the saying of Allah جل ذكره, لم يكن الله ليغفر لهم ولا ليهديهم سبيلا. Allah was never going to forgive them nor guide them to a path. ولا ليهديهم سبيلا. Okay, so there's an an that's assumed between the li and the yaghfir, and that an is giving naṣb to the mudari verb. Okay, so this is the lam of juhud. It's called the lam of juhud. So how do you do i'rab of these sentences? In case you're wondering. Okay, it's a little beyond scope, but I think I can tell you what it is. So since the lam al juhud will always be preceded by ma kana or lam yakun, ultimately what we want the khabar of kana. So we have a kana and we have the ism of kana, and this combination of words is going to become the khabar of kana. So we're going to say that this li is a preposition, not ta'lil. It's not giving reason and cause, but it's there, and I think the scholars they mentioned that it's with the assumption of a muridan. So it's ma kana Allahu muridan liyadhar al-mu'minin. Allah was not intending to do this. Allah was not intending to leave the believers as they are, without creating any distinction between them, like who's sincere or who's a hypocrite. And Allah was never intending to punish them. وَمَا كَانَ اللَّهُ مُرِيدًا لِيُعَذِّبَهُم. So if you pull out the ismul fa'il muridan, and specifically muridan because the khabar of kana is supposed to be in naṣb, and this jar majroor, and the lam is a preposition, this jar majroor will seamlessly connect to muridan and it will become the khabar of kana. So you would say the sentence divides into a kana, an ism of kana, and a khabar. And the ism of kana is Allahu, and the khabar of kana is an omitted via li, verb-like entity, ismul fa'il, and a muta'alliq. And the word is muridan, and the muta'alliq is jar majroor, the li is the preposition, and yu'adhibahum with the assumption of an will be the majroor. Within the majroor we have an an masdariyah, and we have a converted structure. The converted structure then further divides into a fi'l, a fa'il, and a maf'ul bihi. And the fa'il would be the huwa inside yu'adhibahum. And that's how I would do i'rab of this. Okay? So let me know in the comments if you found that helpful, how to do i'rab of sentences that involve the lamul juhud. Okay, so let's move on. وَالْحَرْفُ الثَّانِي, and the second particle, parentheses, after which an is assumed necessarily, is what? Is hatta. وَهُوَ يُفِيدُ الْغَايَةَ أَوِ التَّعْلِيلِ. And hatta communicates either culmination, that a certain action is culminating and ending, or it communicates reason and cause. وَمَعْنَ الْغَايَةِ أَنَّ مَا قَبْلَهَا يَنْقَضِي. And the meaning of ghaya is that the earlier verb is coming to an end by the achievement of what's following hatta. بِحُصُولِ مَا بَعْدَهَا, and the example will make it clear. نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, حَتَّى يَرْجِعَ إِلَيْنَا مُوسَى. So this is coming in the context of the Bani Israel saying to Musa alayhi salam's brother that we're not going to stop worshipping this calf until Musa returns back to us. So the worshipping of the calf will culminate and end, will come to an end when Musa returns. حتى يرجع إلينا موسى. ومعنى التعليل, so the ta'lil wouldn't work here. It wouldn't be that لن نبرح عليه عاكفين حتى يرجع إلينا موسى, that we will continue worshipping this calf so that Musa can return. That doesn't make any sense. So hatta is clearly in the meaning of until. And the second possible meaning of hatta is ta'lil, in order that, so that. ومعنى التعليل أن ما قبلها علة لحصول ما بعدها. And the meaning of ta'lil is for the earlier verb to be a cause for the achievement of the verb that's following hatta. نحو قولك, like you're saying لبعض إخوانك, to some of your brothers, ذاكر حتى تنجح, study hard in order that you succeed, so that you can succeed. Okay, now we're moving on to the next two particles, after which the an is assumed necessarily. والحرفان الثالث والرابع what are they? فاء السببية وواو المعية. The fa that suggests a combination where there's a sequencing between them, that both of them, A and B, while A is playing a role in B. Okay, A and B both together while A is playing a role in B, and waw suggests that A and B without any causality claim between them, that the two of them are occurring together, or the two of them are being avoided together. In the case of a nahi, for example, in the case of a prohibition, don't do this and this. In other words, don't create a combo between them where both of them are the examples will make this like really clear. Okay, and this is important. This is important, and it has great implications in tafsir and in translating verses of the Quran. فاء السببية وواو المعية. But in order for the an to be assumed after this particular fa and after this particular waw, it has to be preceded by an amr or a nahi or a istifham or a tamanni or a taraji or one of those items that he'll list right now. Okay? So you issue a command and then you follow up with a mudari verb and use a fa to do that or use a waw to do that. Okay, examples are forthcoming. بشرط أن يقع كل منهما في جواب نفي أو طلب. Okay, so what he's doing here is remarkable. The commentator, he's reducing the large list, and it's a large list of a lot of items, and he's reducing it to just nafi or talab. So there has to be some element of negation or some element of desire. So you're desiring for something to happen, or you're desiring for something to be avoided in order that it not lead to a second action occurring, or in order that it do lead to a second action occurring. In the case of an amr, so talab would be like amr, nahi, tamanni. Tamanni is longing and wishing, and another example of talab would be like persuasion, when you're trying to plead with someone and persuade them to do something. It's a little like amr, but it's slightly different. And nafi. Okay, so in response to either a negation or a desire. أما النفي, as for the example of negation, فنحو قوله تعالى, the example of that is لا يقضى عليهم فيموتوا. لا يقضى عليهم فيموتوا. They will not ever be concluded. Their lives will never ever be concluded in order that they die. Okay, so in other words, their punishment in the hellfire is ever going and it's eternal and there's no end to it. So this fayamutu is a naṣb. The verb fayamutu is a naṣb, and what's causing the naṣb is the an that's assumed between the fa and the yamutu. How do you do i'rab of that? لا يقضى عليهم فيموتوا. Okay, so you need to be a little creative with this, and you're gonna have to say that the fa is for atf. Okay, the fa sababiyya is like it belongs to a list of particles that are conjunctions, and every conjunction would have a ma'tuf alayna ma'tuf, and what's on the right side of the conjunction, whether it be a fa, whether it be a wa, or whether it be any others from the list, but over here is particularly the fa and the wa, after which the mudari verb could be a naṣb. So this fa is a conjunction. So in consideration of the fa being a conjunction, now its element of sababiyya is like harfu masdarin wa nasbin wa istiqbal. Like every particle does more than one thing. So when you're doing i'rab and when you're analyzing and parsing a sentence, you have to grab onto the word level feature and function. So the word level feature and function in this case would be the atf, because there's principles that need to be satisfied in order for a ma'tuf and a ma'tuf alayh to be a sanctioned method of joining words together in the language. In other words, a phrase level relationship. So what's on the left side of the fa in this case is yamutu, which is a fi'l and a fa'il. It's a fi'l and a fa'il, right? Yamutu and the waw would be the fa'il. However, the an is watering it down and turning it into the meaning of the masdar. So it's in the power of famautuhum. Famautuhum. Their death. They're coming to an end. They're dying. So their death is what's on the left side of the fa. So in order for atf to be valid, what on the right side of the fa and what's on the left side of the fa need to be of the same kind. So what we do with this is we reword it and then we parse our new version. So we don't try to parse the version we have in front of us, but we reword it. We say لا يقضى عليهم لا يكون عليهم قضاء. لا يكون قضاء عليهم. qada alayhim will not happen leading to their death. In other words, these two will not occur in this order. Because if the first one were to happen, then the second one would entail, and the second would follow it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not bring about the first in order to trigger the second. In other words, they're going to live in the hellfire forever and ever, and they will never die. You see? So it's leading to it. So that's what we mean by sababiyya. So we say لا يكون عليهم قضاء فموت. لا يكون عليهم قضاء فموت, and then you do i'rab of that, and you say what's on the left side of the fa is an interpreted masdar, which is ma'atuf on a similar masdar extracted from the previous. Ma'atuf on a similar masdar extracted from the previous, and what that means is that la yuqda is in the power of la yakunu qada'un. I said la yakun, it should be la yakunu qada'un. So qada will not occur leading to death not occurring. In other words, both of them will not occur in this order. Okay? And I think I've explained that sufficiently. It's a little complicated. Okay, and you might want to look up that ayah in one of the tafsir books that specialize in doing i'rab of the sentences within the verses. Actually, I can do that for you right now. I have a book here. It's a big thick book. It's called Imla. It's called what is it called? Yeah. Okay. So give me a second here. Actually, let's leave it because I'm gonna have to find the verse and it will take some time to do that. But maybe in one of the next videos I'll do it for you and I'll show you. وَأَمَّا الطَّلَبُ, and as for talab, it happens, four things constitute talab. What are they? Al-amru wal-du'a wal-nahyu wal-istifhamu. A command, a dua. The difference between amr and dua is happens from a person of authority, a person of a higher status, issuing a command to one of a lower status, like a parent to a child. And a dua would be like a human being using a sighatul amr in order to make a request to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that would be a dua from a person of lesser status to one who is exalted. وَالنَّهْيُ وَالْإِسْتِفْهَامُ, and a prohibition, interrogation. وَالْعَرْضُ, a request. وَالْعَرْضُ is like, why don't you do this? So yeah, it's a request. Okay, like I mean, he's going to give examples, so we'll see. وَالتَّحْدِيدُ, and persuasion. وَالتَّمَنِّي, longing and wishing. وَالرَّجَاءُ, and anticipation, like perhaps. A hope. أَمَّا الْأَمْرُ, okay, he defines each one of them. أَمَّا الْأَمْرُ فَهُوَ الطَّلَبُ الصَّادِرُ مِنَ الْعَظِيمِ لِمَنْ هُوَ دُونَهُ. The definition of amr. What is amr? Amr is the particular request that is issued from one who is great to one who is of a lesser status. From a great one to one of lesser status. نحو قول الأستاذ, like the saying of the teacher to his student, ذاكر, study hard. ذاكر, revise your lessons. فتنجح, in order that you be successful. So in other words, bring into existence memorization and preparation that would then lead to your success. So ذاكر فتنجح أو وتنجح. Okay, so study hard and you will be successful. Study hard in order that you be successful. So the second verb is an interpreted masdar, ma'atuf on a previous masdar, ma'atuf on a similar masdar extracted from the previous. So dhakir would be like awjid al-dhikra. So bring into existence the practice of revising. Bring into existence revision, and then if you do that, you will also bring into existence success. So you will bring both of them into existence. So in other words, being successful is within your control, because if you do the first one, then the second one will follow from it by way of entailment. وَأَمَّا الدُّعَاءُ, and as for a dua, فَهُوَ الطَّلَبُ الْمُوَجَّهِ مِنَ الصَّغِيرِ لِلْعَظِيمِ. So this is the request that's directed from the lower to the more exalted, from the one of lower status to the one who is exalted, such as Allahumma ahdini fa'amal al-khayra. O Allah, guide me in order that I do good. Fa'amal al-khayra, in other words, fa'an a'mal al-khayra. أو وأعمل الخير, guide me and I will do good. Okay, so either you could use the fa if the extra element of reason and cause is important to you, then use the fa. And if it's just the combo that you're concerned with, which could or could not be based on reason and cause, it doesn't negate. They're not mutually exclusive. They're interchangeable. The fa one is just a little more specific. وأما النهي, and as for prohibition فنحو, then the example of that is لا تلعب فيضيع أملك. Do not play games lest your hope be wasted. In other words, lest your goal not be achieved. So in this one, the translation, we use the word lest in English to incorporate the translation. In other words, do not bring into existence amusement and play, as that will lead to your hope being wasted. Being wasted. Notice the master translation there. That would lead to your goal not being achieved. فَيَضِيعَ أَمَلُكَ أو وَيَضِيعَ أَمَلُكَ. وَأَمَّا الْإِسْتِفْهَامِ, and as for interrogation, then the example of that is هل حفظت دروسك فأسمعها لك. Have you memorized your lessons in order that I can hear you say them? Can you say them to me? So instead of creating two sentences, you're combining everything within a single sentence, and you're using a fa to create an arrangement between the memorizing of the lessons and the speaker being able to hear the lessons, because you wouldn't be able to hear it from the person unless they've committed those lessons to memory. أو وأسمعها. Okay, you can use the fa or the wa, slight difference in translation either way. وأما العرض, and as for عرض, that's a gentle request. عرض means a gentle request without issuing a command. فهو الطلب برفق. So in other words, you don't pose it as a صيغة الأمر, but in other words, you ask it as a negative question. ألا تزورنا? Will you not visit us in order that we can honor you? In other words, visit us so that we can honor you. But visiting it is too direct. ألا تزوروا is what we call an ard, and I was struggling with the definition of ard, and he gave it to us, and he gave it to us quite nicely. MashaAllah, the commentator. فهو الطلب برفق. So it's a gentle request, such as ألا تزورنا فنكرمك أو ونكرمك. So will you not visit us so that we can honor you? Will you not visit us and we can honor you? Okay, so it's similar translation. وَأَمَّا التَّحْضِيدُ, and as for persuasion, what does that mean? فَهُوَ الطَّلَبُ. So this again is a request, but مَعَ حَثٍ وَإِزْعَاجٍ, with persistence and insistence. So you're doing it like you're doing it in a demanding way. Okay, or insistence I think is fine. وَإِزْعَاج. In other words, you're actually disturbing the person. نحو هلا أديت واجبك. Why haven't you fulfilled your responsibility? Why haven't you satisfied your responsibility? فَيَشْكُرَكَ أَبُوكَ, so that your father could be thankful to you. فَيَشْكُرَكَ أَبُوكَ. Or you could say وَيَشْكُرَكَ أَبُوكَ, and it would be an example of a wow. All of these examples could be with the fa or with the wa. The common thing here is that the an is assumed, and the mudari verbs that are following the fa and the wa will be in Naṣb. And the way you do i'rab is you take what's on the left side of the fa or waw and consider it an interpreted masdar and make it ma'tuf on a similar masdar extracted from the previous. So you'd have to interpret the earlier part and change it into like ala tazuruna ala yakunu minka ziyaratun fa ikramun. Okay, ala yakunu minka ziyaratuna fa ikramuna iyaka, like that. So will not these two things occur in this order? Will you not visit us so that we can honor you? So ikramuna iyaka is the fa'an nukrimaka would be interpreted into the meaning of ikramuna iyaka, our honoring you. So we're the ones doing the honoring and you're the one that's being honored. So that ikramuna iyaka would need to be ma'tuf on ziyaratuka iyana. Ala yakunu ziyaratuka iyana fa ikramuna iyaka. Okay, it's really, really awkward. Like, people don't speak like that. I know, people don't speak like that. But in terms of parsing and understanding the i'rab of the sentence, that's how you do it. Okay, inshallah, in the next video, I'll pull out the book, the grammar book, the i'rab of the verses book, and I'll show you a couple of examples of this, and I'll read to you how they did it. Okay, just for the sake of completion. Okay? Continuing. وَأَمَّا التَّمَنِّي فَهُوَ طَلَبُ الْمُسْتَحِيلِ. And as for longing and wishing, that would be desiring something that's either impossible, like a person becoming young again, and for youth to return, that's something that's never going to happen, or something that's incredibly difficult. أو ما فيه عسرة, or that in which there's great difficulty. نحو قول الشاعر, like the saying of the poet, ليت الكواكب تدنو لي فأنظمها. If only the stars could come closer to me so I could string them up in a necklace, so I could string them up, the stars, I could string up the stars, عقود مدح, into a necklace of praise. فما أرضى لكم كلمي, because I'm not happy with my words. So I'm not able to praise you with my words, so I need something bigger than that. I need the stars to come closer so I can turn the stars into a necklace of praise and give that to you. Okay, so obviously he's speaking poetically, and he's saying, and he's making a desire for something that's not about to happen anytime soon. ليت الكواكب تدنو لي فأنظمها عقود مدح فما أرضى لكم كلمي. ومثله قول الآخر. And another example of tamanni is a statement of another poet. He says, ألا ليت الشباب يعود يوما. Alas. So ala means alas. If only youth would come back one day, فأخبره, and then I would inform it and tell it about what old age has done to us. بما فعل المشيب. وَنَحْوُ لَيْتَ لِي مَالًا, if only I had wealth in order that I could perform the Hajj. So this is not technically impossible. It's, a person can become wealthy. So if only I had wealth, then I would be able to do the Hajj. وَأَمَّا الرَّجَاءُ فَهُوَ طَلَبُ الْأَمْرِ الْقَرِيبِ الْحُصُولِ. And raja is when you hope for something that's understandably easy to achieve, something that's achievable. Al-qarib al-husul means achievable. You're desiring something that's achievable, such as لَعَلَّ اللَّهَ يَشْفِينِي. Perhaps Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will cure me, and then I will come to visit you. فَأَزُورَكَ. وقد جمع بعض العلماء هذه الأشياء التسعة التي تسبق الفاء والواو في بيت واحد. And some of the scholars have gathered these 9 items that need to precede the fa and the wa in a single line of poetry, and it is as follows: مر وادع وانه وسل وعرض لحظهم تمنى وارجو كذاك النفي قد كملا. Okay, so I haven't really studied Arabic poetry, so I'm not familiar with meter and rhythm and syllable structure and all of that. So, but I can sort of tell you what he's saying. Mur is a reference to command. Wad'u means make a dua. Wanha means prohibit. And sal means ask a question, istifham. Wa'arid and lihaddihim, and make a gentle request because of their persuasion. Due to their persuasion, tamanna. If you do that, wa'arid lihaddihim tamanna. So, yeah, tamanna means wish, warju, and be hopeful. Kadaka nafyu, similar to all of what was just listed, is also negation. Qad kamula. Okay, I'm sure there's a meaning associated to this line of poetry, and I think I'm going to leave it for the sake of time. Let's continue. وقد ذكر المؤلف أنها ثمانية. And the author mentioned that there are 8. He didn't say 9, he said 8. لأنه لم يعتبر الرجاء منها, because he left out hope and he did not consider it to be part of the list. الحرف الخامس, the 5th particle, after which an is mandatorily assumed, is أو. ويشترط في هذه الكلمة أن تكون بمعنى إلا. And it's stipulated in the case of this particular harf for it to be in the meaning of illa. In other words, otherwise, in the meaning of otherwise, or in the meaning of until. وضابط الأولى, and the rule of أو being in the meaning of إلا أن يكون ما بعدها ينقضي دفعة, is for what follows the أو to end immediately, like all at once. لأقتلن الكافر, I will absolutely kill the disbeliever, أو يسلم, unless he becomes a believer, unless he becomes Muslim. وضابط الثانية, and the rule of the second is أن يكون ما بعدها ينقضي شيئا فشيئا, is for what follows the أو to end gradually, such as the saying of the poet, لأستسهلن الصعب, I will absolutely I will absolutely make the difficult matter seem easy. أو أدرك المنى until I reach my goals. Until I reach my goals. فمن قادت الآمال فمن قادت الآمال إلا لصابري. Because hopes and desires do not become subservient except to the one who's patient. I guess that's what he's saying. Okay, yeah, so the difficult matter, I'll treat it like it's easy. I'll approach it as if it's easy, and I'll keep doing that أو أدرك المنى until I achieve all of my desires and hopes and objectives. فمن قادت الآمال إلا لصابري. And that concludes the amount that we're doing for this session, and all of the nawaṣib of the mudari have been covered. And the next video would then tell us about the jawazim. And so we'll end it here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala ma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, so now we're continuing with the jawazim al-mudari, the particles and also the isms, adverbs in particular, that enter before the mudari verb and induce jazm and cause the mudari verb to go into the state of jazm, the indicator of which would normally be sukun, but depending on what you have in front of you, it could be hadf as well. It could be the omission of the last letter of the verb, if it's a waw, alif or ya, or it could be the omission of a noon, if you're dealing with one of those al-af'al al-khamsa. قال والجوازم 18. The muallif, the author, he says والجوازم, the jazm givers to the mudari are 18, without specifying whether they're isms or whether they're harfs. He says there are 18 in total. The agents of jazm. You can say the agents of jazm. Or al-adawat. The term they use is al-adawat. And if you want to go more specific, you say huruf. Right? But not all of them are harf. That's why he uses the more broad term jawazim. Wahiya, and they are lam, walamma, wa alam, wa alamma, walamul amri wa du'a'i. So he's counting them. The commentator will give us the detailed meanings of every one of them with an abundance of examples. Okay, but I can briefly tell you what they mean. Lam means not, as in did not occur, did not help, did not hit, did not sit, did not stand. So it would take the verb back into the madi. So it's a harfu jazmin, harfu nafyin wa jazmin wa qalb. So it negates, it causes jazm, and it turns the verb, it flips the verb back into the past. So that's the future and function of lam. Lamma is similar to lam, except lamma has an element of continuity, of negation within the past, and anticipation that the action will occur sometime in the near future. So it hasn't happened yet, but the likelihood is that it will happen anytime. So lamma yazuqu adab. These people have not yet tasted our punishment, which is a threat. It means that they should anticipate that the punishment will occur on them any moment if they don't change their ways and if they don't believe the evidence and the truth. Okay, so that's lamma. And then it could have a hamza at the front of it, so we have alam and alamma. Alam would turn it into a rhetorical question. Alam nashrah laka sadrak? Have we not expanded for you your chest? Alam nashrah? Of course we have. So it's a rhetorical question. So it's called the hamzatul taqrir, and the commentator will talk about this. And alamma, same thing, and he'll give examples. Walamul amri wa du'ai. And the particular lam that comes at the beginning of the mudari in order to suggest a request or a prayer. So this is a talab, it's a desire, but the common meaning is desire. And if it's directed from one of elevated status to a lower, like a teacher to a student, then that's called amr. And if it's from a person, a human being, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that will be considered a dua. Okay, and we have the same thing with the prohibition. Wala fi nahi wa du'ai. So these are all particles that come at the beginning of the mudari verb and they induce jazm. And then we have in, wa ma, wa mahma, wa idma, wa ayyun, wa mata. So in is a harf, and in means if. It's the most basic conditional particle out there. If you come to me, I will honor you. If, okay, whatever the example is, you can create hundreds of examples. And ma includes the meaning of if in it, but also has the element of a thing. So there's an entity there. So it's like whatever book you read, you will benefit from it. ما تقرأ من كتاب تستفد به. ما تقرأ تستفد به. Whatever you read, you can expect to benefit from it. It won't be useless. Okay? Mahma, it also means whatever. Okay, but it's a little different. Okay, so the commentator will talk about these things. And then we have idma, which means whenever. Ayyun means whichever. Mata means whenever. Aina means wherever. Ayana means Aina means whenever, suggesting time. Ayana can mean wherever and whenever. It can mean either one of those two. Anna means however. Okay, حيثما means wherever. كيفما means however. وإذا في الشعر خاصة, and the word إذا, specifically if it comes in poetry, then the mudari verbs that follow it will be in Jazm. All of this is coming in great detail, and at the end of this video, inshallah, we'll conclude this segment and we'll create the deep dive, and then after this, the remainder of the book will be given to you in about 14 or so days, inshallah, so you can look forward to that. Hopefully people actually go through this. Okay, it's my desire that you actually go through this, and post in the comments, let us know how you're doing. Whenever you finish a lesson, just post in the comments. Like, I mean, if you posted once, there's no bar against posting again. Treat the comment section underneath the YouTube videos as a place to learn, as a place to inform us of how you're doing. And if you have questions, then by all means, ask your questions below. If you need something retranslated in a different way, you can ask for that as well. And inshallah, I'll try to help you out to the best of my ability. Okay? وأقول, the commentator says, الأدوات التي تجزم الفعل المضارع 18 جازما. The agents that give jazm to the mudari verb are 18 jazm giving agents. وهذه الأدوات, and these agents, تنقسم إلى قسمين, divided into two groups. القسم الأول, the first type, كل واحد منه يجزم فعلا واحدا. So he's not doing it based on whether it's a harf or ism. He's saying the categorization is based on whether it's a single verb that's being given jazm, or is there some conditional element built into the meaning. And if there's a conditional element built into the meaning, then you would expect the verb to be followed by, you would expect the agent to be followed by two verbs separated by a comma, and both verbs would be in jazm. So like if then. So the first one's called shart, and the second one's called jawabu shart or jaza. Okay, and he'll mention all of this. القسم الأول كل واحد منه يجزم فعلا واحدا. The first type, every agent that belongs to this type will give jazm to a single verb. والقسم الثاني كل واحد منه يجزم فعلين. And the second type, every one of the verbs that belong to this second type, every one of the agents that belong to this second type will give jazm to two verbs. يجزم فعلين. أما القسم الأول فستة أحرف. As for the first type, then it consists of 6 particles, and they're all harfs, actual particles. And it's actually just 4, and he makes it 6. And the reason he makes it 6 is because he takes the alam and alamma, which are really 2 words. Hamza is the interrogative harf, the particle hamza. It turns the statement into a question, but in this case it will be a rhetorical question, as we'll see in a minute. And alamma. So lam and lamma and alam and alamma never needed to be listed separately, but I mean, we can't argue on that. Like it's a personal preference, like how you want to categorize. Okay, so we have walam wal amri wad du'ai. These are all harfs. Wala fi nahi wad du'ai, and the particular la that's used for prohibition and used for supplication. وكلها حروف بإجماع النحاة, and all of these are particles by consensus of the grammarians. There's no dispute, there's no difference of opinion. أما لم, as for lam, فحرف نفي وجزم وخلب. So this is a particle that number 1 negates, number 2 induces jazm, and number 3 flips the meaning of the verb from whatever tense it has back into the past. نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لم يكن الذين كفروا. These disbelievers were never. Okay, and then were never what? So the sentence will be ongoing. Okay, the sentence would continue. So it doesn't complete here. But the point of the example is that kana means to be, and kana means was, and lam yakun means was not. So it's past. The verb is a mudari, but the translation is past tense. وَقَوْلُهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَقَوْلِهِ سُبْحَانَهُ, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا, say you have not believed. You've merely submitted. and you've accepted the authority, but belief has not entered into your hearts. قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا, you have not believed. وَأَمَّا لَمَّا, and as for lamma, فَحَرْفٌ, so it too is a harf. There's another lamma which is an ism, but this lamma is a harf. Okay, the one that's an ism means when. This one here, it means not. It's just like lam. It's a harfu, it's nafi, jazm, and qalb, which is what he says. فَحَرْفٌ مِثْلُ lam, it's a particle as well, similar to lam, in terms of negation, in terms of causing jazm to the upcoming verb, and in terms of flipping the verb into the past. Okay, but then there's a difference. He doesn't talk about the difference here. Okay, in other grammar books they talk about this. They say it suggests continuity in the past, that the negation in the past is like it's never happened, not yet. So like in English when you say not yet, it's like suggesting that up until now, at any given moment in the past, this particular action has not happened, not yet. But when you say yet, then the listener, the audience, understands that there's a likelihood, there's anticipation that it will happen sometime in the near future. It's just a matter of time. Look at the example he gives. نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, بل لما يذوقوا عذاب, rather they have not yet tasted my punishment. وأما ألم فهو لم, and as for alam, then this is really lam. زيدت عليه همزة التقرير, to the beginning of which has been added, the hamzatul taqrir, the hamza harf, which is for a rhetorical question, which in this case would be affirmation. Okay, so the reason he says hamzatul taqrir and he doesn't use the normal term to refer to this hamzatul istifham, is because it's not a genuine question, it's a rhetorical question. A genuine question is when the speaker is unaware and does not know and is asking and seeking clarification, seeking to know, and that question is posed. And when the speaker already knows, but it's formatted as a question in order to impress upon the audience that of course it's the case. It's not even worth asking. Of course it's the case. Look at the example he gives. So if it's affirming, the benefit of the rhetorical question is to affirm, then that's called hamzatul taqrir. And if the benefit of the rhetorical question is to negate, then that's called hamzatul inkar. Okay, and this has relevance in tafsir. It comes up all the time. The commentator in the Jalalain highlights whether the hamza is for taqrir or is it for inkar, or is it really a genuine question. Okay, so whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala poses a question, then it's going to be one of the rhetorical questions for obvious reasons, right? نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ألم نشرح لك صدرك, have we not expanded for you your chest? Of course we have. وأما ألما, and as for alamma, which the author listed as the fourth one, he's saying that this is really lamma, زيدت عليه الهمزة, to the beginning of which has been added the same hamza. And the example he gives is ألما أحسن إليك, have I not yet been good towards you? Okay, which is a little weird. Okay, is it true that I've never been good to you? Okay, so because you wouldn't use it in an interrogative environment, like the way the author is using it here. At any rate, that's what it means. And again, the translation is not that important. I'm just doing it for like as a bonus. وأما اللام, and as for lam, فقد ذكر المؤلف أنها تكون للأمر والدعاء. So the author mentioned that the lam is used for both commanding as well as supplicating. وكل من الأمر والدعاء يقصد به طلب حصول الفعل طلبا جازما. And both the amr and the dua, through it, the objective is to desire that an action happen in a definite way or in an absolute way. So desire forcefully. So when the desire is forceful and it's not merely a suggestion, then that's called amr and dua. The difference is that amr happens from the one at a higher level directed towards one of a lower status, and he says that وَالْفَرْقُ بَيْنَهُمَا أَنَّ الْأَمْرَ يَكُونُ مِنَ الْأَعْلَى لِلْأَدْنَى. And the difference between amr and dua is that amr occurs from one who's at a higher level directed towards one who's lower. كما في الحديث, as it's come in the hadith, فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ, then this person should either speak good or remain quiet. فَلْيَقُلْ, so this is فَلْيَقُلْ, and it becomes فَلْيَقُلْ. when the conjunction comes before it, then the lam becomes sakin. أو ليصمت أو ليصمت, or the person should remain quiet. وأما الدعاء فيكون من الأدنى للأعلى, and as for dua, it occurs from the lower level person to the one who's higher. نحو قوله تعالى, like the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the people in the hellfire, they'll say ليقضي علينا ربك, like your Lord should just finish us off. In other words, we desire that your Lord bring death to us and just end our situation, end our suffering. وأما لا فقد ذكر المؤلف أنها تأتي للنهي والدعاء. So as for la, then here too the author mentions that it comes for both prohibition as well as supplication. وكل منهما يقصد به طلب الكف عن الفعل وتركه. And each one of them, through it is sought, through it the objective is to seek avoidance of the verb and to abandon it. Stay away from it, and if you're doing it, then stop doing it. وَالْفَرْقُ بَيْنَهُمَا, and the difference between nahi and dua is that أن النهي يكون من الأعلى للأدنى, same as the amr. نحو لا تخف, don't fear. ونحو لا تقولوا راعنا, do not say راعنا. ونحو, and the further example is لا تغلوا في دينكم, do not be excessive in the matters of your religion. وأما الدعاء فيكون من الأدنى للأعلى, and dua happens from the adna to the ala. نحو ربنا لا تؤاخذنا, O Lord, do not bring us to judgment, do not take us to task. وقوله, do not make us accountable. وقوله جل شأنه, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ولا تحمل علينا إصرا, and do not place upon us a burden. Okay. وأما القسم الثاني, and as for the second category of jawazim, وهو ما يجزم فعلين, and that would be those that cause jazm to two verbs. ويسمى أولهما فعل الشرط, and the first of those two is labeled and called the verb of shart, the condition. وثانيهما, and the second one is called جواب الشرط, or it's called جزاء الشرط. فهو على أربعة أنواع. So this second category is of four types. So he's going to say some of them are particles, some of them are isms, some of them there's a dispute and difference of opinion, and the correct opinion is that it's a particle, and some of them in difference of opinion, and the correct opinion is that it's an ism. So that's how he creates four categories. Okay, so pretty useful. Look what he says. النوع الأول حرف باتفاق, and the first category of jazm giver that induces jazm on two verbs is a harf by consensus, and the second would be an ism by consensus. The third would be a harf according to the more correct position, and the fourth is an ism according to the more correct position. So he doesn't tell us what they are yet. So he's broadly speaking, here's what the broad categories are, and then he's going to talk about each one separately, what belongs to each group. Okay, حرف باتفاق, والنوع الثاني اسم باتفاق, والنوع الثالث حرف على الأصح, والنوع الرابع اسم على الأصح. أما النوع الأول فهو إن وحده. As for the first category, it only has one member, and that's in, on its own. نحو إن تذاكر تنجح. If you revise and discuss your lessons among yourselves, then you'll be successful. So part of the madrasa way of learning is that the teacher would teach the dars, and then in the evening, before the next day's class, the students would sit together in groups and they would go over what was taught in class. So that's what mudhakara is. Discuss among yourselves. Or revise. فَإِنْ حَرْفُ شَرْطٍ جَازِمٍ. So حَرْفُ شَرْطٍ جَازِمٌ. So in is a particle of shart, and it's a jazm giver, بِاتِّفَاقِ النُّحَاة, by consensus of the grammarians. يَجْزِمُ فِعْلَيْنِ, it causes jazm to two verbs. الأول فعل الشرط, والثاني جوابه وجزاؤه. The first is called the فعل الشرط, and the second one is called either the جواب الشرط, or they refer to it as the جزاء. وتذاكر, and تذاكر is the فعل مضارع فعل الشرط, and it's a jazm, it's in the state of jazm because it's the فعل الشرط مجزوم بإن, because of the in. وعلامة جزمه السكون, and the indicator of jazm on it is the sukun. وفاعله ضمير مستتر فيه وجوبا تقديره أنت. Now what does that mean? Okay, so like if you're studying this book, then chances are you probably already know what that means, like what he means with that expression. So this is something that will come later in the book, And when he talks about the marfu'at, and he talks about the fa'il, that the fa'il could either be a noun or it could be a pronoun. If it's a pronoun, then it could be an explicit pronoun that's visible, attached to the verb in the form of a letter or two letters, like the fa'ala, the alif in fa'ala, or the waw in fa'alu. That's a dhamir, which is baris. Or the dhamir, the pronoun, could be carried within the verb where you can't see it. And the carrying could be permissible, or the carrying could be wujuban. Okay? So I guess I could spend about 5 minutes on this. Okay, so hopefully you get it, and let us know in the comments. Basically, if we go back to our tables that we learned in sarf, fa'ala, fa'ala, fa'alu, fa'alat, fa'alata, that one, and yaf'alu, yaf'alani, yaf'aluna, taf'alu, taf'alani, yaf'alna, that one, basically all verbs would return back to those two. Okay, because amr is created from mudari, and nahi is also created from mudari. So the set of endings that are on the madi table are all pronouns, and the set of endings that are on the mudari table are also all pronouns. Now, in the case of the madi table, if you go from top to bottom, you'll notice that the majority of them have something to represent the he, they, she, they, you, I, we. So that's what we're talking about. That's the dhamir. Okay, two of them don't have a pronoun attached to them, and that's fa'ala and fa'alat. Fa'ala has nothing at all. Fa'alat has a ta, but that ta is a harf. That ta is not a pronoun, it's a harf. And the evidence and proof that it's a harf is that if you put a fa'il after it, like Zainab, and you say Zainab stood, it's qamat Zainabu. And if it was a pronoun, then the pronoun would drop. Okay, because if I say dakhalu, which means they entered, people entered, but if I use the actual word people, then I don't say dakhalu and Naṣb, because that's a mistake. Because it's either or, right? Every fi'l must be followed by a fa'il, either in the form of a noun or a pronoun, never both. Never both. The never both part is important. So when nas comes, the waw goes away, it becomes dakhala nas, and if they ask you what's the total number of words, the answer is 2. There's the fi'l and there's the fa'il, and there's no pronouns. The verb is empty. But if I flip it and I say an-nasu dakhalu, now dakhalu is carrying, now dakhalu has the waw. If I use a singular conjugation, then I can create those two examples for that as well. ذهب زيد and زيد ذهب. ذهب زيد, the ذهب is empty. It's not carrying anything because the fa'il is there. If I flip it and I say زيد ذهب, now ذهب, the fa'il of it is not Zayd because Zayd's first. So Zayd would be mubtada. And ذهب would have a fa'il, and the fa'il of ذهب would be the dhamir that's mustatir within it, and that's implicit within it, and it's jawazan. And the reason it's jawazan is because it doesn't have to be carrying a pronoun. There's a possibility it could be empty. Okay, does that make sense? So for the madi, fa'ala and fa'alat, both of those have the potential and have the possibility to be carrying pronouns. And when it means possibility, it means that they're not always carrying it. So that's jawazan. Now if you go yaf'alu, yaf'alani, yaf'aluna, taf'alu, taf'alani, yaf'alna, yaf'alu and taf'alu, on them the exact same discussion would apply. So you say yadhabu zaydun, zaydun yadhabu. And yadhabu zaydun, yadhabu is not carrying anything because Zayd is sitting there on the left side of the verb. And zaydun yadhabu, yadhabu has a pronoun, and the pronoun is taqdiruhu huwa, the assumption of which is huwa, and it's mustatir within the verb jawazan. Okay, because like I can give you an alternate example where the pronoun is not there. Now if you go in taf'alu number 7, taf'alu, when you're speaking to someone, like ya Zaydu tadhabu, okay, oh Zayd, you are going. So now if you do i'rab of this, you say tadhabu is the fi'l, within tadhabu is the pronoun anta, which is mustatir wujuban, because there's no situation, there's no instance where the conjugation number 7, you go, will be empty of a pronoun. It will have a pronoun always. So that's what he means. So in the madi table, the 14 conjugations, 12 of them the pronoun is baris, and 2 of them is mustatir, and the istitar is jaizan. It's not wujuban, it's not wajiban, it's jaizan. In the mudari table, in 5 of the 14 conjugations, which are yaf'alu, taf'alu, taf'alu, afalu, nafalu, in these 5 the pronoun is mustatir, the rest of them are baris. Like the plural feminine ones, yaf'alna, taf'alna is clearly there, yaf'alani, taf'alani, yaf'aluna, taf'aluna, taf'alina, they all have something sticking out. So in all of them, the pronoun is baris. But in the 5 conjugations, lam yattasil bi akhirihi shay ones, those ones, including the 14th one, naf'alu, the pronoun is mustatir. Now from these 5, 2 of them, the istitar is jaizan, And in 3 of them, the istitar is wajiban, and that would be the you when you're speaking to a male, wahid mudhakkar, mukhatab, and the mutakallim one, and the both mutakallim ones. The singular mutakallim, af'alu, and also the plural mutakallim, naf'alu. In both of those, the grammar scholars, they say that the pronoun is mustatir, but it's not just any mustatir, it's the mustatir istitaran wajiban. Okay, and that's what he talks about here. Okay, so that was a mini discussion. Hopefully you found value in it. Okay, so let's continue. Right, so when he says all this, then he's assuming somebody taught you that already. Like everything I just told you right now, somebody taught you that already, so that then this would make sense. Because without that background information, you're not going to be able to figure out what he's saying here. Okay, did you get that? Did you understand that? Okay, now in the Hidayatun Nahu book, he talks about these things as well. Okay, so most of my students that are doing this, going through this series of videos, have already studied the Hidayatun Nahu book, so they're aware of these things. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so what is he saying? He's doing إعراب. He's saying تذاكر is a فعل مضارع فعل الشرط مجزوم بإن وعلامة جزمه السكون. That's fine. وفاعله ضمير مستتر فيه, and the fa'il of تذاكر is the pronoun which is implicit within it, وجوبا, mandatorily implicit within it. Like you can't bring it out, you have to keep it in it. تقديره أنت, the assumption of which is أنت. In other words, تذاكر is not one word. تذاكر is 2 words. وتنجح, and then he says the same thing about تنجح, that it's also carrying a pronoun, and the pronoun would be anta, and it's being implicit within the verb is wajib, and to bring it out and say tanjah anta would be a mistake, to say tudakir anta would be a mistake. Okay, and to bring a noun to represent the fa'il would also be a mistake, because it's a second person. In second person you don't bring a noun. Okay, by definition, right? وتنجح فعل مضارع جواب الشرط وجزاؤه مجزوم بإن وعلامة جزمه السكون. So he says literally the same thing about the second verb. وَفَاعِلُهُ ضَمِيرٌ مُسْتَتِرٌ فِيهِ وُجُوبًا تَقْدِيرُهُ أَنْتَ, exactly the same. وَأَمَّا النَّوْعُ الثَّانِي وَهُوَ الْمُتَّفَقُ عَلَى أَنَّهُ اسْمٌ, and as for the second category of agents that give jazm to 2 verbs, then that would be those on which there's agreement of there being an ism. Okay, فَتِسْعَةُ أَسْمَاء, and there's 9 isms that belong to this category. Most of them are adverbs. Some of them are nouns, pronouns, and some of them are adverbs. Okay, conditional adverbs, as you'll see. وَهِيَ, and they are man wa ma. Man means whoever. It's a conditional pronoun, and ma means whatever. وَأَيٌّ وَمَتَى وَأَيَّانَ وَأَيْنَ وَأَنَّ وَحَيْثُ مَا وَكَيْفَ مَا. I give you their translations above, and let's now get some more details on them, including examples. فَمِثَالُ مَنْ, so the example of man is قَوْلُكَ, your statement, مَنْ يُكْرِمْ جَارَهُ يُحْمَدْ, whoever honors his guest, whoever honors his neighbor, يُحْمَدْ, is praiseworthy. وَمَنْ يُذَاكِرْ, and whoever does mudhakara and studies their lessons properly, يَنْجَحْ, will be successful. So what man, what man does is conditional. In other words, it has the who meaning, but it's inclusive of the meaning of in, which is if. So it's an abbreviated way of saying, if Zayd honors his neighbor, he'll be praised. If Muhammad honors his neighbor, he'll be praised. If Khalid honors his neighbor, he'll be praised. And then you list the whole human race. But instead of listing the whole human race, you can just, capture it all in the single word man. So it's efficient. So that's what it is, right? Man on its own means who. But then there's several kinds of who. There's a man that's used for asking a question. That's not this one. And this is how you would tell whether the man is for istifham, it's the interrogative man, like who are you, or who is it, who is traveling, or who is honoring their guest. Like you're asking a question, who is honoring their guest, as opposed to whoever honors his guest, comma, will be praiseworthy. So now you get a bit of an idea why the mudari verb needs a mechanism, because confusion can occur. Like when you're speaking, like the audience would not be able to tell whether you're asking a question. Now obviously, if they listen more, then they'll see that you're following up with the second verb, and the interrogative one wouldn't have a second verb, you see. But the point here is to make it easy for the audience, so they don't have to exert mental energy in order to connect the dots, and you want to make it like really obvious. So having a dhamma at the end of a verb versus having a sukun at the end of the verb after the man, it seals the deal quickly. so they don't have to do the inference, if that makes sense. Okay, so remember we said that isms in the Arabic language can be used in 22 different ways, and since sequence doesn't determine the grammar, we need a way of being able to differentiate between the roles. So they have this entire system. The Arab people, they have this system called i'rab. It's the process that's likened to human emotions and facial expressions. And we have 22 possible ways the ism could be used, but we don't have 22 different endings. All we have is 3. And then they're distributed. Okay, so more on this in the next session when we study the roles of the isms. So that was based on need and necessity. So whenever you have a verb and 2 nouns, you have to be able to tell which of the nouns is the one doing the verb and which of the nouns is the one upon whom the verb is being done. So we start with that and we lead with that and we use some examples and analogies and we communicate that to the beginner student so that they can understand very clearly the purpose of these case endings from the get-go. Before talking about indicators, before talking about dhamma, before talking about the obscure ones, like the waw and the alif and the 5 isms, the abuka, akhuka, like all that stuff is obscure, you see. So having spent like the last 10 or so hours creating these videos, what I've gotten is a greater appreciation of the 3-hour workshop. So if you didn't take that 3-hour workshop seriously, and you thought maybe it's not worth your time, then I would strongly suggest you go back and rewatch it. Okay, it's really, really impactful, and it's revolutionary, if I may say so myself. Okay, because it's truly taking the elements of grammar that are the most important and taught them first, which this book does not do. Okay, so if you've ever wondered why these grammar texts are so complicated, now you know why. Okay? Because there's no relative importance. Because they're not sequencing the topics in the way that's more optimal for the beginner student who is not a native Arab speaker. The al-ajrumiyyah book was written for people that already knew Arabic and they had learned it intuitively since they were kids, and they're just being given details. So it's not that these details are useless, they're useful, but they just need to be taught at the correct time. So hopefully that's the big takeaway here, okay? Is that fine? Right. Okay, so continuing, so he says, he gave a couple of examples. وَقَوْلُهُ تَعَالَى, and the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى, whoever does an atom's weight of good will absolutely see it. فَمَنْ يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا. So this khayran word here is actually Manṣūb on the basis of tamiz, and tamiz will be talked about in one of our final classes. We'll tell you exactly what it is. Okay, the point of the example is Ya'mal is in Jazm and Yara is also in Jazm. The alama of the Jazm on Ya'mal is the sukun, and the alama of the Jazm on Yara is the hadful alif, because it should have had an alif, Yarahu. So instead of Yarahu, it says Yarahu. Right? And the first one would be called fi'lu shart, and the second one would be called fi'lul jaza. وَمِثَالُ مَا قَوْلُكَ, and the example of ma, the conditional ma, is مَا تَصْنَعْ تُجْزَ بِهِ. Whatever you do, you will be rewarded, or you will be compensated, you will be recompensed accordingly. وَمَا تَقْرَأْ تَسْتَفِدْ مِنْهُ, and whatever you read, you will benefit from it. وَمَا تَفْعَلُوا مِنْ خَيْرٍ يُوَفَّ إِلَيْكُمْ, and whatever good you do, it will be granted to you in full. The reward of it will be granted to you in full. So over here we have تَفْعَلُوا, it's lost its noon, and then over here we have yuwaffa, which should have been yuwaffa with an alif, and the alif dropped as a sign of jazm, as an indicator of jazm. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now he doesn't do the detailed i'rab of وَمَا تَفْعَلُوا مِنْ خَيْرٍ يُوَفَّ إِلَيْكُمْ. That's fine, we'll leave it as well for the sake of time. Let's keep going. وَمِثَالُ أَيٍّ, and the example of أَيٍّ, which means whichever, is you're saying أَيَّ كِتَابٍ تَقْرَأ تَسْتَفِدْ مِنْهُ, whichever book you read, you'll benefit from it. وَأَيَّمَّا تَدْعُو, and whichever name of Allah you call on, whichever name of Allah you use to make dua to Him, فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, then to Him belongs all the most beautiful names. فَلَهُ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. وَمِثَالُ مَتَى, and this ma here is extraneous. Okay, أَيَّمَّا. Okay, وَمِثَالُ مَتَى, and the example of mata is you're saying مَتَى تَلْتَفِتْ إِلَى وَاجِبِكَ, whenever you pay attention to your responsibility, تَنَلْ رِضَى رَبِّكَ, you will acquire the pleasure of your Lord. Okay, وَقَوْلُ الشَّاعِرِ, and the saying of the poet, أنا ابن جلاء وطلع ثنايا متى أضع العمامة تعرفوني. He's saying, I am the son of Jala, and I am the one who explores the mountain valleys. I am the son of Jala and the one who explores, and the explorer of the mountain valleys. Mata ada'il imamata, which is the point of the example. The verb is ada' with the sukun on the ain. Mata ada'il imamata, whenever I put down my turban, you will know me. You will recognize me. Ta'rifuni. Okay, whatever he means, whatever he's saying, the point of the example is the last part. Ta'rifuni. So ta'rifunani becomes ta'rifuni. Both verbs are in Jazm. وَمِثَالُ أَيَّانَ, and the example of أَيَّانَ, which means whenever, okay, is you're saying أَيَّانَ تَلْقَنِي, where whenever you meet me, I will honor you. Or wherever you meet me, I will honor you. أَيَّانَ تَلْقَنِي أُكْرِمْكَ. So the verb here is تَلْقَى, lost its alif تَلْقَى. And أُكْرِمُ becomes أُكْرِم. وقول الشاعر, and the saying of the poet, فَأَيَّانَ مَا تَعْدِلْ بِهِ الرِّيحُ تَنْزِلِي. So wherever the wind becomes moderate, okay, you will have a place to land. I guess that's what he's saying. Tanzili. وَمِثَالُ أَيْنَمَا, and the example of أَيْنَمَا, which means wherever, is you're saying أَيْنَمَا تَتَوَجَّهْ تَلْقَ صَدِيقًا. Wherever you head, you will come into contact with your friend. You will meet your friend. وقوله تعالى أينما يوجهه, whichever direction he sends it in, لا يأتي بخير, it never comes back with anything good. Or whichever direction you put him in, like a slave, يأتي بخير, he's not able to do anything productive because he's blind or whatever the case is. وأينما تكونوا يدرككم الموت, and wherever you are, death will overtake you. Okay? And here too, the point of the example is takununa, lost its nun, takunu, and the second verb yudrikkumul mautu. Yudrikukum became yudrikkum. ومثال حيثما قول الشاعر, and the example of حيثما is حيثما تستقيم يقدر لك الله نجاحا في غابر الأزمان. Wherever you're upright, morally upright, and a decent person, يقدر لك الله نجاحا, Allah will decree for you success in all of the past times. Okay, I'm not sure what he's talking about. Let's keep going. ومثال كيفما, however, قولك كيفما تكن الأمة يكن الولاة. However the community are, that's how the rulers will be. So in other words, if the people are corrupt and evil, then the rulers appointed on them will similarly be corrupt. وَكَيْفَمَا تَكُنْ نِيَّتُكَ يَكُنْ ثَوَابُ اللَّهِ لَكَ. However your intention will be, يَكُنْ ثَوَابُ اللَّهِ لَكَ, Allah's reward for you will be likewise. وَيُزَادُ عَلَى هَذِهِ الْأَسْمَاءِ التِّسْعَةِ. In addition to these 9 isms, there's also إِذَا, which is an ism. It means when, but in this context it would mean whenever. In poetry, كما قال المؤلف, as the author stated above, وذلك ضرورة, and this is based on necessity. نحو قول الشاعر, like the saying of the poet, استغن ما أغناك ربك بالغنى. Remain self-sufficient as long as your Lord keeps you satisfied or provides to you with wealth. As long as your Lord provides to you with sustenance and wealth, don't become greedy, don't become needy and dependent on others, because Allah's made you self-sufficient. وَإِذَا تُصِبْكَ خَصَاصَةٌ, and when poverty or starvation afflicts you, فَتَجَمَّلِ, then have good conduct. In other words, remain composed and don't resort to begging, for example. وأما النوع الثالث, and the third category, وهو ما اختلف فيه أنه اسم أو حرف, and that would be the category of jawazim, in which there's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars of whether it's an ism or a harf. والأصح أنه حرف, and the more correct position is that it is a harf, in that there's one particle that's included within this type. فَذَلِكَ حَرْفٌ وَاحِدٌ وَهُوَ إِذْ مَا, and that would be إِذْ مَا. And the example of it is the statement of the poet, وَإِنَّكَ إِذْ مَا تَأْتِي مَا أَنْتَ آمِرٌ بِهِ ما أنت آمر به تلف من إياه تأمر آتيا. Okay, this is cool. وإنك إذ ما تأتي ما أنت آمر به تلف من إياه تأمر آتيا. Okay, so what is he saying? He's saying that verily, whenever you do the thing that you command others to do, the thing that you're commanding others to do, in other words, when you walk your walk, you're not just talk, you actually do what you say you do. What you tell others to do, you adopt it yourself, and you're not a hypocrite. So when you do the things that you're commanding others to do, you will find tulfi. This tulfi is alfa yulfi, and it should have had a ya at the end, and the ya dropped because of jazm. Tulfi, you will find the person that you're commanding also engaging in that activity. Atiya. Okay, so man iyyahu ta'muru atiya. So atiya is the second maf'ul bihi for tulfi. You will find this person to be an atiya, to be one who is adhering to your command, because he sees that you don't just preach, but you do the things that you suggest others to do. So he'll be more likely to also adopt that behavior. وَأَمَّا النَّوْعُ الرَّابِعُ, and as for the fourth category of jazm giving particle, وَهُوَ jazm giving agent, وَهُوَ مَخْتُلِفَ فِي أَنَّهُ اسْمٌ أَوْ حَرْفٌ وَالْأَصَحُ أَنَّهُ اسْمٌ. And here the more correct position is that it's an ism. So he's saying فَذَلِكَ كَلِمَةٌ وَاحِدَةٌ, it's a single word, and that would be mahma. And the example of it is the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَقَالُوا, and they said, the Bani Israel, they said to Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, مَهْمَا تَأْتِنَا بِهِ مِنْ آيَةٍ, or is the ancient Arabians, the Quraysh, they said, مَهْمَا تَأْتِنَا بِهِ مِنْ آيَةٍ, whatever miracle you produce and whatever miracle you bring to us, in order to captivate us thereby, لِتَسْحَرَنَا بِهَا, in order to bewitch us through that sign and through that miracle, فَمَا نَحْنُ لَكَ بِمُؤْمِنِينَ, we will never believe you as a result of it. We will never be believers in you for it. Okay, okay, so that's what it means. وَقَوْلُ الشَّاعِرِ وَإِنَّكَ مَهْمَا تُعْتِ بَطْنَكَ سُؤْلَهُ وَفَرْجَكَ نَالَ مُنْتَهَى الذَّمِّ أَجْمَعًا. And verily, مَهْمَا تُعْتِ بَطْنَكَ سُؤْلَهُ وَفَرْجَكَ. Okay, mahma here it doesn't mean whatever. Up there it means whatever. Or maybe it means whenever. Whenever you bring to us a miracle or a sign in order to captivate us, then we're not going to believe in you. So over here, وَإِنَّكَ مَهْمَا, and verily, whenever you give to your stomach what it's seeking and what it's asking, and also you give to your private parts whatever they're desiring, in other words, you satisfy their lust unconditionally, نَالَ, the two of them will acquire مُنْتَهَى الذَّمِّ أَجْمَعًا, the highest level of all dispraise. Okay, that's what he's saying. Let's keep going, and I think that concludes it. The jawazim are done, and now it's tamrinat, which we'll skip, and then that concludes the amount of material we're covering in this deep dive. And inshallah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks with the next leg of the book, and our plan is to inshallah complete the book. Post in the comments. Okay, let us know how this is going. If you're making this far, I'm expecting like maybe a 1% of people are actually making it to this stage. If that's you, then let us know in the comments, okay? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.